Before the first hymns were sung and before marble learned the patience of temples, there was a hush like breath held in the chest of the world, a dark, tidal quiet where mountains seemed to sleep standing up and the sea had not yet learned the color of daylight. In that ancient stillness, the eldest powers stirred, broad-shouldered titans whose names felt like cliffs and rivers, Oceanus circling the rim of things, Tethys with her cradles of springs, Hyperion kindling a coal that would later be called the sun, and Theia whose glance taught brightness how to gleam. They were not yet enemies of anyone. They were pillars, patient as dusk, humming deep notes that the earth could lean upon. And from their union with the vast and the nameless came rhythms, the long breathing of winter and summer, the slow turning of stars that walked in measured steps across a ceiling not yet painted blue. Sometimes, when storms rolled in their sleep and the ground muttered in its dreams, you could imagine a lullaby passing from one horizon to another, a low song meant to keep the young cosmos from waking too soon. In that time, the boundaries between creature and land were more uncertain. Stone felt almost alive, and rivers listened. Even memory had not chosen its favorite stories yet. But there was, as always, a rumor of change. Earth, the mother who knew the ache and wonder of beginnings, bore children who were both comfort and question. Among them were the Cyclopes, one-eyed and blazing with craft, and the 100-handed who could hold a storm in each palm. And there was Sky, Uranus, whose shadow fell across everything she made, stern and unbending, jealous of any shape that might grow too tall. He hid the strange and powerful children, as if putting thunder back into rock and light back into the coal. And what mother can bear to see her strength locked away beneath her own skin? So a plan formed, not in words, but in the sharp scent of cut stone and the hush of a new edge. The youngest of the Titans, Kronos, learned to listen where others only heard silence. He listened to the pauses between waves and the breath at the bottom of night, and in those pauses he found resolve. With a blade born from the heart of the earth, cold, glittering, a thought made metal, he stepped between fear and future. The sky bled hours, the sea took them in, and the world, startled into wakefulness, learned that time moves because something once decided it must. From that first severing came 1,000 echoes, some of grief, some of relief, some of prophecy. The old order, as old orders always do, began to count its days. Kronos reigned, and under his watch the seasons put on their robes and practiced their entrances. Yet even a throne fashioned from inevitability trembles at a whisper. He had heard a murmur, one of those small truths that cross the centuries on tiptoe, that a child of his would surpass him. So he swallowed them one by one, as if tomorrow could be kept quiet by keeping mouths from speaking. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each a candle cupped in his hand, then hidden in his throat, each a future pressed back into the dark like a seed refused its spring. What kind of sleep is that, where dreams are not allowed to be born? Earth, who had asked for courage once, asked for it again. This time it came in the shape of a stone wrapped like an infant and a cave that could keep a secret. The last child, small, fierce, with eyes that already measured distances between what is and what could be, was carried away to an island that knows how to hush the sea with honeyed winds. There, the goat who nourishes thunder fed him. There, nymphs taught him the grammar of leaves and how to step softly along the ribs of mountains. And when he laughed, it sounded like hail learning to be music. The old lullaby of the Titans took on a new verse, quicker, brighter, with a pulse inside it. We are told that the clatter of youth playing at soldier is harmless until the day it isn't. The child grew, and the island grew with him, or perhaps it was only that he learned to read its silences. He gathered allies, the forgotten, the hidden, the ones whose power had been pressed under the heel of dread. The Cyclopes came with flames cupped like gifts. The 100-handed flexed their dawn-wide grip. Destiny is such a grand word, yet often it begins as a quiet agreement between friends to meet at a certain hour. When the hour came, the long sleep of the Titans cracked like ice at river's end. Mountains stood to their full height, valleys held their breath, even constellations, those future stories, leaned closer, as if they wished to be accurate when they were finally named. They say stones can remember. If so, the stones remember how shields rang like iron bells and how the sky shuddered with the tug of war between what had been and what must be. Lightning learned its path that day. Thunder found its signature. The sea rehearsed its rage and its mercy. The struggle lasted years measured in earthquakes, 10 perhaps, though what is a decade when time itself is the subject of the quarrel? And yet, amid the clamor, echoes of that first lullaby persisted. The Titans were not monsters, they were foundations, and even foundations feel a kind of love for the walls built upon them. But love does not always win against the gentle cruelty of the necessary. At last, the balance tipped. The eldest were laid down in a place of deep horizons, where doors are made from cliffs and keys from thunder. The world did not cheer so much as exhale. Sky and earth, relieved but changed, took one cautious step apart so that morning might learn to arrive and depart without tearing the world. And the child, no longer a child, accepted a coil of power that behaves like weather and appetite and law all at once. He raised a hand. Storms learned obedience. He set a crown, peaks reflected it. He spoke, and the air believed him. But even as victory gathered into order, a question lingered in the space where lullabies fade. When a new song begins, what happens to the old one? Does it vanish, or does it remain, humming softly in the bones of mountains? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps all beginnings are braids. Perhaps the past nestles under the current like a whale beneath a boat, vast, unseen, and perfectly capable of rolling everything into a different story. The new rulers built homes in the brightness above, where clouds are friendly and nectar smells like afternoons. Laws were negotiated with waves, harvests promised to fields, and the linked chains of mortal days were forged patiently in workshops below volcanoes. There would be feasts, quarrels, romances that stitched constellations into the pauses between tales. There would be heroes who mistook the edge of the map for the edge of courage, and poets who learned that truth often wears a mask thin enough to see through if one is gentle. But before all that, there was a moment, the kind that only night understands, when the sea pretended to be stone and the stars pretended not to watch. A hush gathered over the foam, a breeze tested its first rumor of perfume, and the old lullaby, retiring, made room for a softer melody rising out of salt and distance. Somewhere, far out, a scallop shell trembled as if the horizon had just breathed a secret. The sea was almost asleep when she arrived, a faint hush upon the waves, as if the world had pressed a finger to its lips. Foam gathered like milk around a secret, and gulls circled without calling, as though they too felt that something tender was about to open its eyes. From the far hush where horizon and sky pretend to be the same, a shell drifted forward, a cradle made by patience and the sighing labor of tides. And within it, soft as breath at the edge of a dream, rose a figure whose presence taught the morning how to blush. No fanfare, no trumpet from the caves of wind, only the quiet applause of small ripples tapping the shore, and the first petal of light unfolding on her skin. The nymphs came with garments like watered silk. The breezes became tailors for a moment and stitched brightness to her shoulders. Even the dolphins, those cheerful courtiers of the sea, swam in gentler loops, careful not to splash. One hand gathered her hair, heavy as sea-wet wheat, and the other rested at her side as though asking the foam to remember. It is said she stepped onto land the way dawn steps into a room where someone sleeps, leaving behind a path of softened sand, as if the earth wanted to keep the print of that first kindness. People will debate origins, the scholars with their scrolls, the poets with their metaphors, the children with their wide believing eyes, and none of them are wrong, for beginnings have two lives, the one that is carved in careful lines by those who wish for order, and the one that is carried by sighs and lullabies, where truth is felt before it is named. She was both. She was the sudden agreement between the salt of the sea and the sweetness of desire. And she was also the old memory of life yearning toward beauty, as a vine climbs toward sun without needing permission. Where she walked, the wind learned manners. Where she looked, the light remembered something gentler than victory. Not yet a queen, not yet the quiet axis of whispers and quarrels. She was simply an arrival, proof that tenderness can be a power without raising its voice. Around her, the world rearranged itself in small, respectful motions. Shells turned their polished sides toward her. Reeds held still. Even bees visited flowers in slower thoughts, as if honey should be brewed from patience. If a sailor had anchored nearby, he might have felt his heart tilt, away from maps crowded with warnings and toward an interior coastline where longing draws its own charts. And yet, because stories rarely travel alone, her coming carried complications, like shadows folded into sleeves. For wherever beauty settles, comparisons begin, and with comparisons come envy, and the old, precise ache of wanting to be chosen. Already, somewhere inland amid olives and quiet birds, a goddess with gray eyes felt a new ripple in the web of honor. Far below, in the houses of craftsmen, wives wondered whether their husband's gaze would wander, and whether wandering eyes could be taught their way home by a faithful lamp in the window. But in this first hour, none of that clamor had risen. The beaches were still sanctuaries. The shell lay open like a paused word, and the sea, relieved to have birthed and not lost, tugged at her ankles with affectionate, transparent hands. They say roses discovered a deeper red that day and that the myrtle found its signature, a fragrance that leans close without insisting. Even rocks, which seldom admit to softness, wore a sheen that felt like a smile they forgot to hide. She moved as if every step consulted the ground, and every glance asked permission of the air. To love, she seemed to suggest, is not a conquest, but a conversation. To desire is not to seize, but to learn the shape of what is longed for, and to carry that shape carefully, as one carries water, cupped in two palms across a bright courtyard. Some days this lesson is remembered, many days it is not. But the lesson exists, and its source was the woman who came ashore on a morning delicate as eyelids. One might ask, what has such softness to do with the larger order of things, with thunder and law, with brine and iron? The answer is woven into the way ships are named before they sail, and the way fields are blessed before the plow bites down, and the way even kings touch the hilts of their swords, lightly when thinking of home. Strength without a companion often grows brittle. Law without a smile somewhere in it forgets who it was meant to protect. She arrived to be that companion, that smile, that pause in which a harsher world can exhale and choose differently. Of course, not all chose well. Temples would be razed and broken, vows made and broken too. There would be garlands flung at altars by hands that later trembled, alliances sealed by looks that lingered too long at banquets where the wine knew everyone's secrets. In time, her quiet would be given louder names: scandal, trial, the judgment of apples rolling toward fate. But at the shoreline, she was only the possibility that beauty might guide rather than mislead, heal rather than injure, join rather than divide. And if the gods felt the stir of rivalry, mortals felt also the courage to become a little gentler with one another. Fishermen knotted their nets without cursing. Mothers sang while mending. Lovers spoke less about forever and more about tonight's moon, which is a softer and perhaps truer promise. Even the old men who carved chessboards beneath porticos set down their knives for a while and allowed memory to visit with its sweeter album. It is a tender thing to admit we want tenderness. Perhaps that is why her worship grew from blushes as well as prayers. Some placed seashells on their windowsills as if keeping a small doorway open to that first morning. Others braided myrtle into their hair, not to boast, but to remember that the heart thrives when approached with care.
And the sea, always the sea, kept her secret, that she is not only storm and hunger and the chewing of cliffs, but also nurse and midwife, bearer of cradles, singer of rhythms that even infants understand with their small, astonished hands. As the sun climbed and the day learned to hum, the shell that had carried her rocked once, twice, like a mother convincing herself to let go. She turned, not in farewell but in gratitude, and a line of light traveled from her eyes to the far-off rim where blue becomes silence. In that line, many destinies would later walk. Kings dazed by love, artisans making cups so fine they trembled, poets who learned to hide ache inside metaphor, and ordinary people who discovered that kindness can be chosen even when no one is keeping score. Night would come, with it, songs with songs, vows whispered too softly to be heard by anyone except the moon. But before the day retired to its cool chambers, a small company of doves descended, folding the air into white commas around her head, as if granting punctuation to a sentence the world wanted to keep reading.
And somewhere far inland, in a workshop dim with soot and genius, a different rhythm clicked into place, the patient beat of hammers shaping gifts for a love that would never quite learn to be simple. For now, though, the coastline yawned, content, and the last lace of foam drew itself thin upon the sand. If you are listening from a distant country, tell me quietly, where are you, and what time is it in your night? If your eyelids grow heavy, let them, and if your heart wishes to return to shores like this, subscribe to the entire history so we can meet again where stories walk barefoot. Later, quarrels will rise like weather, and choices will harden into myths. But tonight, in the soft breath between tide and hush, a woman steps from a shell, and the world, holding its breath, learns a new meaning of arrival. While far away, in the high places where fire thinks, a secret spark wonders whose hand will dare to carry it into the dark. Night had learned to fold itself neatly along the mountain's edge when he came, a quiet figure with eyes like cooled iron and a patience that did not quarrel with silence. They called him Forethought, and it suited him, for he listened to what was not yet said and watched for paths that did not yet exist. And from these he shaped decisions as a potter shapes vessels, turning, until usefulness found its curve. He had watched the gods in their bright assemblies speak the language of thunder and decree, had watched mortals below shiver in the dew of their own breath, huddled in caves where darkness taught the alphabet of fear. Perhaps pity is too simple a word for what he felt. Perhaps it was a kind of kinship with beings who were still learning the grammar of their days, still trying to tell time by the trembling of their hands. They struck stones and found only brief, sulky sparks that died as soon as they were born. They knew the taste of raw root and the ache of winter's teeth. They wrapped themselves in shadows and called it shelter. He saw in them not weakness, but unawakened music, and he knew, the way the quiet know, without announcement, that a single ember could become a door through which the future would step and sit down beside them.
The trouble was not whether fire would be loved, but whether it would be permitted. Those who command storms often prefer a world where need bends the knee, warmth makes the spine straighter, and straightened spines look toward questions. And so he made of his resolve a lantern and walked the corridors that stars use when they wish to remain unseen. Some say he crept into the workshops where lightning rehearsed. Some say he cupped a secret coal from the chariot of the sun when it slept in a hollow of westward hills. Others imagine he simply asked the dawn for a favor, and dawn, being soft-hearted, agreed.
However it was, he stole it softly, the way a lullaby steals the edge from grief, and hid the ember in a reed, a modest vessel that looked like nothing at all to eyes hunting for grandeur. He carried it down the spine of the world, each step a negotiation with fate, and each breath a promise that he would bear the consequence himself. Below, the first recipients did not at first understand, for gifts of this size wear humble clothing. But when the reed breathed, and a golden tongue lifted itself to the air and began to speak in warmth, they felt their bones remember sunlight on the marrow. Fear loosened its knot. Shadows became choices instead of prisons. They learned to ask wood to share its story in crackles and light. Learned that food could be persuaded into sweetness. Learned that night was not a verdict, but a canvas. Around the first hearths, faces became legible to one another in new ways. Love smelled of smoke and clean ash, and the clumsy wonder of invention set up a permanent camp in human hands. Of course, it was not simple. Fire brings courage, but also appetite. It teaches togetherness, but also independence. And the gods, feeling the tilt of authority, frowned in their halls where everything already gleamed.
Historians, those patient listeners to echo, still argue whether the punishment was just law or fearful pride, whether a world burns brighter when some powers remain outside the reach of the small. But he knew what he had chosen, the risk that accompanies kindness, the ache that blooms in a heart which refuses to keep its knowledge to itself. For his part, they fastened him to a lonely rock where morning always arrives on time, and evening never forgets to darken, and a sharp-winged habit of the sky visited daily to search his ribs for pardon. Pain became a calendar. Hope, in its stubborn way, continued to keep better time, for below, mortals were changing.
Stories lengthened because days lengthened. Tools learned the hand's dialect. Songs discovered harmonies that could be braided across firesides. Strangers, warmed, took the first wary steps toward being neighbors. Children pointed at sparks and guessed futures. And deep in the mountains where metal sleeps, another god heard the new talk and wondered how to answer with anvils and patience. Prometheus, let us call him by the name that expects tomorrow, looked up when clouds argued, and thought not of himself but of the little orange mouths singing under new roofs. Did he regret the winged torment? Perhaps at dawn, perhaps at dusk.
Yet regret is rarely the whole story. In the quiet between visits, he must have remembered how a woman held her palms to the flame and recognized herself, not as a creature just surviving, but as someone about to begin. There is a kind of love that returns without being invited, as rivers do. He had that love for them, and it was enough. The gods debated, the sea listened. The mountains, who have the longest memories, held their counsel. Some say the king of thunder felt a twitch of admiration he did not care to name. Some say the chain chisels dulled at times, as though stone itself could be persuaded to show mercy.
And in the villages, beneath low roofs and good smoke, they began to tell his story, the one who thought ahead and accepted afterward. the giver who sat down at the end of the gift and took what followed. They raised cups to him, not loudly, but with a steadiness that felt like prayer. By glow light, they learned the soft mathematics of baking, the slow logic of pottery, the first geometry of shelter. Even the night beasts, uncertain, kept a respectful distance from the ring of warmth and found other paths to hunger. And as skills multiplied, so did questions. If we can warm our food, can we warm our grief? If we can summon light with a spark, can we make justice arrive with a word? Fire does not answer directly. It suggests, it listens, it remembers. It knows how to turn raw tree into the language of stars and how to teach patience by the length of a coal's breath. If you are listening far away, tell me softly where your hearths burn and what the hour is where you rest. Let your eyelids wait like leaves at evening, and if these murmurs keep you company, subscribe to the entire history, so we may meet again when the embers whisper. For the tale does not end with one act of theft, nor one long sentence carved in agony. Even chained, a mind like his is a workshop. He dreamed of another helper, of a brother who sees calamity coming across the meadow while he studies the seed packet in his hand. He dreamed of a box that is not a box, a jar that is not only mischief, but also the last small bird called hope, stubborn as a weed at the edge of a road. He dreamed, perhaps, of a day when the chain rusts not from rain alone, but from the prayers of those he warmed. And somewhere, in a cave softly bright with furnace glow, a limping god considered how best to answer the new human hunger, with hinges and plows and rings that hold promises without hurting the finger. The reed that once hid the ember lies now dried among other reeds by the river, indistinguishable. But if you pick it up and tilt it to the light, you might still see a thin stain of gold along the inner wall, as if the world keeps an autograph for every kind beginning. And up on that bitter rock, as stars amend the ledger of the sky, and the wind hums its low, indifferent tune, a man who stole quietly for love closes his eyes, and in the thin sleep allowed him, he hears not the wings coming. For once but the distant, ordinary music of pots, laughter, and the soft, satisfied sigh of wood becoming light. In a chamber where night does not end but only thins to silver, 3 figures keep a quiet watch over the seams of becoming. Their hands move with a patience older than thunder, and the room listens the way a harbor listens for the tide. One draws from a spool that never seems to empty, coaxing a thread out of the hush itself. Another measures with fingertips that remember every heartbeat ever uttered. The third carries a small, grave blade that gleams like the last thought before sleep. They are not cruel, though fear has given them stern reputations. They are intimate with limits, with the mercy of endings and the discipline of beginnings. Cloth is kinder than chaos, and so they weave. The first, she who spins, gathers from the quiet a filament fine as breath, and as it unspools, she hums a melody one might mistake for wind in winter wheat. The second, she who measures, draws the length with an attention that dignifies what it touches, neither lavish nor stingy, as if each life were a cup to be filled to its brim, but not beyond. The third, she who severs, does not hurry. She watches the cloth, waits for the right syllable in the sentence of time, and when it arrives, she punctuates. Even the blade seems to sigh as it closes. And yet, if you sit there, just outside their lamp's pale circle, among the moths and low, bookish shadows, you notice something gentler than legend. Their work is communal. Their glances are full of a sisterly speech that needs no voice, and sometimes they pause, as if listening to a mortal story that has become unusually musical. The loom is strung not only with people but with cities, tempers, friendships, unforeseen rescues, the patient arithmetic of seeds, the courage that arrives late but still in time. Every thread carries its own weather, its own scent, smoke from a father's coat, salt from a grandmother's shawl. In the far corners of the room lie tangles of what-ifs and knots of regret. The first two tease them smooth. The third keeps the scissors folded, patient as a midnight nurse. From their lamp one can see, faintly, the paths below where men and women make plans that imagine tomorrow as a promise rather than a negotiation. Do they smile at our certainties? Perhaps a little, but the smile is not unkind. For even they know that freedom is not the absence of pattern, but the grace with which one moves inside it. The poets come closest when they murmur that a melody is freer than noise. Within the stave, song learns to fly.
Historians who collect echoes for a living still argue in their libraries. Does destiny command, or does it accompany? Are we scripted, or are we steadied? The room with the loom never answers, but the shuttle seems to hesitate sometimes when a person chooses mercy where anger would have felt more natural, or truth where convenience had already set the table. It is as if the pattern learns from us as we learn from it, as if the cloth itself admires a well-made seam. Heroes cross their threads, a king who cannot keep his temper, a woman who keeps a promise that costs her everything. A sailor who learns the language of stars while the sea pretends not to be listening. The three do not cheer, but the spindle hums a little brighter. They have watched empires, the rise that everyone mistakes for permanence, the soft betrayals that follow feasts, the brave repairs that follow betrayals, the moment when a child born far from palaces walks into a city carrying a quiet that changes the air. They have watched small mornings play their small music in kitchens the world never learns to pronounce correctly, and they have watched those mornings outlast kings. Thread after thread, the tapestry refuses to be only tragedy. At times the sisters set aside the human cloth and tend the wider bolt. The seasons signed in migrating light, the conversation between moon and tide, the slow, generous calculus of forests that exchange sugars underground, like old friends keeping confidences. Fate, in their keeping, is not a cage, but a conversation with limits, the kind that gives the violin its voice and teaches rivers to reach the sea without losing themselves. Still, the blade exists. It exists for the exhausted, for the completed, for the merciful conclusion that spares a story the indignity of becoming its own caricature.
Some endings are mercy, some endings are instruction, some endings are invitations to the living to love differently tomorrow. At the table's edge, where cut threads rest a moment before being gathered, there is no pile of trash, only a mild, shimmering quiet, like dew that remembers every blade of grass it ever touched.
Now and then, a visitor arrives, one of the bright ones who rule weather and law, or a messenger with winged sandals who knows every shortcut through shadow. They do not bargain here, for bargaining presumes a marketplace, and this room is a chapel. But questions are asked. Advice is sometimes received in the form of a pause, or a lifted gaze toward a dark skein no one else had noticed. A certain ruler once came with thunder in his pocket and pride in his jaw. He left with his hands less closed. Another arrived with a grievance. The third sister let the scissors rest against her palm until the grievance remembered its humanity and fled. The sisters do not punish, for life will do that plenty. They correct with proportions, with the math of enough. Outside, a boy tosses pebbles into a pond. Ripples cross the reflection of a crescent moon, which accepts the interruption and goes on being a crescent moon. Such is their teaching.
If you are listening from a distant shore, whisper where you are, and tell me gently what time it is where you rest. Let the night have your shoulders for a while. If you find comfort in the idea that your life is a thread among threads, strong by the company it keeps, subscribed to the entire history, so our quiet walks through old rooms can continue at the pace of breath. For there is more to tell, always more, of gifts hammered in caves where sparks rise like small constellations, of jars mislabeled as doom that secretly keep a stubborn bird of hope, of queens who learn to mother courage while locked inside puzzles built of fear. The cloth on the loom now darkens to a rich dusk color along one narrow band, and within that band, a girl sits on a wooden stool in a chamber that smells of rain and old bronze. Her father, kind and careful, yet commanded by warnings he barely understands, keeps her hidden from the weather of prophecy. Above the roof, the sky practices its glittering grammar. Beyond the walls, city streets go on with their barter of olives and rumor. She listens to the wind as if it were a tutor, and discovers that loneliness, when treated gently, can become a cupboard where wonder is stored. At the loom, the spinner's fingers quicken. The measurer leans forward. The keeper of the blade closes her eyes the way one does when hearing a delicate instrument tune its first note. Outside the chamber, no door opens. Instead, there is a hush, like sunlight being sifted, a powder of brightness finer than any rain. And in that suspended breath between promise and arrival, the tapestry waits, luminous, for the whisper that will change the room. In the hush that followed the whispering of threads and the soft patience of the blade, a chamber breathed like a seashell, holding within it a girl whose days had been folded carefully by a father who feared the grammar of prophecy. Stone walls remembered rain as a kindness that could not enter, and bronze bars kept company with motes of dust that danced in shafts of light as if practicing freedom without ever quite leaving. She sat on a wooden stool, Danae, with the stillness of someone who has learned that movement can be mistaken for rebellion. Her hands were scholars of quiet tasks, smoothing a linen's edge, counting breaths in the long afternoons, coaxing a lullaby out of absence. Outside, the city changed its colors with the sun. Sellers of olives rehearsed their jokes, sandals whispered over warm stones, and rumor, that small, quick animal, skittered under eaves. Inside there was a diligent silence. The door seldom spoke. The window, a courtesy too narrow for a body, just wide enough for a bird's question, let in a narrow ribbon of blue that wound itself around her shoulders and lay there like a mild promise. Acrisius loved his daughter the way frightened men often love, with a clutching that mistakes possession for protection. He had traveled to hear the oracle and returned with a cold seed lodged in the soil of his heart, that a grandson, his daughter's son, would unmake him. Fear builds with tools more precise than affection. He used them all. He built walls, summoned guards, shut the calendar on her spring. People argue still, historians in their ambered rooms, poets at the edges of sleep, whether fate is a road we must take or a landscape we cannot help but breathe. The difference matters less to those living under ceilings that do not change, where days are counted by echoes and the belovedness of a single patch of sky. Danae learned the wildlife of light, how it arrives, how it pauses, how it slips away like a cat that never meant to stay. She learned the vocabulary of metal, hinge, bar, latch, each a syllable in the language of no. And yet, within her, something continued to tend a small garden of yeses, watering it with wonder, pruning it with patience. On the day the story bent its course, there was a fragrance in the air like stone deciding to remember the sea. The ribbon of sky deepened. The dust, usually indifferent, seemed to listen. The first sign was not thunder, but the politeness of a changed brightness, a gold that did not glare, but welcomed, like late afternoons visiting with warm hands. It did not enter as a man would, nor as a king would, For kings bring argument and men bring footsteps. It arrived as weather does, persuasive and inevitable, and as music does through any opening that admits breath. A rain of gold, they say, yet not coins, no bribery jingled there, only a shower of fine, luminous grains, as though the sun had discovered a way to fall safely, to touch without burning. It threaded itself through the narrow window, collected along the edges of the room like a good rumor, pooled softly in her hair, and spoke without words. A language the heart recognizes long before the mind drafts its proofs.
Was it holiness or trespass, blessing or theft? Scholars still quarrel gently in footnotes, but the room, ask the room, will tell you it felt like the first warm day, after a season that had forgotten how to end, like a cup of light held to her lips. The girl who had been guarded from the world found the world arriving anyway, not as threat, but as invitation textured with wonder. She lifted her face, and in that lifting something answered, the way a seed answers when soil gives permission. There are stories that batter. This one poured. There are arrivals that announce. This one listened.
In the quiet aftermath, the gold receded like tide, leaving a mild gleam along the stone as if to say that rooms, too, can keep confidences. Days resumed their humble chores. Danae went about the small economies of care that stitch 1 hour to the next. But the loom in the sister's chamber had picked up a quicker rhythm, and her body, faithful to the whisper it now carried, learned a second heart. News does not travel only by mouths. It travels by glances, by the way a girl holds herself like a lamp under her ribs, by how fear tightens in a father's jaw. When Acrisius learned, he counted options as a miser counts coins and found that mercy could not be afforded. He had obeyed the warning, and the warning had arrived anyway, gentle as rain, unstoppable as season. So he chose a box where a cradle belongs, a wooden coffin with a lid that fit too well, and he chose the sea as an accomplice. They placed her and the swaddled future into the chest. Nails learned to bite, ropes learned to speak in knots. Danae laid her palm against the wall that had become a boat and spoke to the wood with the politeness of the desperate. Mothers have ancient pacts with oceans. They ask, and sometimes the ocean, moody but not heartless, ottes. Out beyond the harbor's gossiping mouths, the water lifted them in weary kindness. Night remembered its lullabies. Stars leaned close, and if they judged, kept it to themselves. A child's breath, that small bell, rang evenly. His name had not yet been spoken into the world's ledger, but the world already knew it the way a field knows rain before it falls. In the mornings, when light rolled its coin along the rim of the chest, she told him stories in a voice smooth as olive oil poured from a clean jar. Stories of gardens never seen, of kindly goats, of a future island where boys learn to read the language of oars and women teach the sea to mind its manners. The chest drifted as hope drifts, sometimes forward, sometimes in circles, but always refusing to sink. Fishermen glanced up from their nets and felt an old tug in the sternum, the reminder that rescues are duties disguised as accidents. When at last the chest sighed against a shore and the lid was persuaded to be generous, a man with hands smelling of salt and cedar lifted them into the day, and the island remembered how to be a sanctuary. Some say it was Seriphos. Some argue another name that has forgotten its own syllables. Islands are shy about fame. What matters is that kindness practiced its old craft there. The boy took milk and then language. He learned tides and the good stubbornness of oars. He learned from his mother the arithmetic of courage that does not advertise itself. Years would braid themselves into strength. A mirror would one day become a shield. A monster would be taught that terror, too, has a reflection. But that is for later, when wandering stars consent to be named. For now, the birds claim the morning with signatures of sound, and the island's rocks, having once seemed like teeth, become chairs. If you are awake in a far country, tell me softly where you listen from, and what time in your night keeps you company. If this gentle voyage of a mother and her child steadies your breathing, subscribe to the entire history, so we can meet again where waves hush the old alarms. For the tapestry is not finished. Elsewhere, in a city of clever hands and clear eyes, a contest waits beneath an open sky. An olive dreams in its pit of roots that might grip a new hill, and a vigilant bird blinks in the rafters, learning the music of wisdom before it has to speak. The hill was not yet crowded with columns when the question rose into the air like a kite tugged by many hands. Who shall keep watch over this city? Who shall tutor its courage and cradle its thought? The earth herself seemed to lean closer, that low, stony eminence above the scattered houses and the thin smoke of morning fires. Shepherds paused on the slopes, potters dusted their palms. Even the small gods of doorways and bread held their breath.
From the long blue grammar of the sea there came a deep, persuasive sound. Hoofbeat or wavebeat, no one could say at first. And then the tall Lord of Waters stood upon the rock, beard braided with the stories of shipwrecks and rescues, eyes the color of stormlight. He struck the stone with his trident, and the hill flinched slightly, as any creature might when touched by power. Up from the wounds sprang a spring, quick and proud, its first glittering water leaping as if to salute the sky. The people cheered until the bravest among them tasted a fingertip and found the mouth of the spring spoke in salt.
A useful blessing, yes, if one means to build fleets and to speak in the language of conquest. A sign of speed and reach, yes, if the city were to choose the horizon over the hearth. Poseidon's voice rolled over them, a promise of horses, those thunder-shouldered companions of ambition, and of roads that would run under their hooves like taut bowstrings. He spoke of fame that arrives quickly like a squall, and of victory that glitters like fish scales in a net. Many hearts tilted toward him. Desire is a sprinter and loves the suddenness of hooves. Then, from the quiet grammar of wind, there came a different presence, keen and lucid as a blade whose edge has been loved by whetstone.
She did not announce herself with roar or spray. She came like a sentence that finally finds its verb. Gray-eyed, with an owl's exact attention lingering in her gaze, she stood where the rock remembered the first footprints of thought.
She knelt, not dramatically, but with that pared-down grace that respects the thing it touches, and with her spear she parted a small seam in the soil. Into that dark pocket she pressed a kernel wrapped in its own patience. The crowd waited. And then, as if answering an old invitation, a slender shoot shouldered up, put on leaves the color of night's gentler hours, and steadied itself in the new light. They saw, before they knew, what it meant. The olive kept its counsel for a long green minute. Then the air discovered a fragrance like clean hands after work, like lamps lit without smoke. From its future would come food that keeps through winter, oil that asks lamps to burn with quiet, wood that bends into oars and furniture, and the small tools that lengthen human cleverness. From its fallen leaves would come shade, from its roots a promise to stay. The people, wise as thirst, sensed the difference between a gift that dazzles and a gift that endures. A city, after all, is not only a rampart against enemies but a workshop for minds, not only a harbor for ships, but a courtyard for conversation, not only a training ground for the body, but a school for what the heart calls good. The Sea Lord's jaw tightened. A wind rose with it, combing the hillsides as if to find an argument hiding in the grass. He named his claims again: speed, reach, the iron taste of triumph, the great horse that carries men toward their next desire. She named hers without speaking, letting the olive say, I am slow and I am faithful. I teach patience. I feed your children. I light your evenings so that ideas can grow where fear once nested. Judges were summoned. Some say the high assembly of the bright ones. Some say the king with snake's wisdom coiling at his feet. Some say the people themselves with their palms open to the sunlight of choice. However the choosing was arranged, the listening was real. They looked from wave to leaf, from trident's flash to owl's unwavering attention, and they asked themselves what kind of city they wished to be when the century grew old and winter pressed its ear to the door. Applause is noisy. Consent can be quiet. A murmur gathered like bees finding the queen, foreheads softened. Hands reached involuntarily toward the tree as if greeting an ancestor. The decision was not so much made as recognized. The Lord of Waters heard it first and frowned, not out of pettiness alone, though gods are not strangers to that, but from the older ache of being refused by those he might have made great on different terms. He stamped. The new spring shivered. Somewhere below the cliff, a horse reared inside the foam and then dissolved back into the grammar of waves. She, receiving their choice, did not smile broadly. She set her hand upon the young olive, and you could feel the hill exhale. The city would learn to argue without ruining its bridges, to sail without forgetting home, to carve statues that taught marble to become motion, and to write laws that tried, clumsily at first, better with practice, to secure more than the convenience of the powerful. From her came schools that were also courtyards, councils that were also rehearsals for mercy, theaters where grief could be studied into understanding before it hardened into bitterness. She brought with her not certainty but a habit of questions, the owl's pivoting head that checks every angle before declaring yes. Poseidon did not vanish. No city on a coast can afford to forget the moodiness of water. They built him altars, too, and asked him to be their stern uncle rather than their enemy. But on the hill, the olive grew rings like lessons, and children learned to count by touching its bark. Girls and boys watched the owls in twilight, their round faces like moons practicing being serious. When wars came, as wars always do, they returned to the tree afterward, ashamed and relieved, to ask how to be clever again without becoming cruel. Potters mixed a drop of oil into the clay and claimed it made the touch steadier. Wrestlers rubbed their shoulders and claimed it made courage less brittle. Widows lit their lamps and claimed it made memory kinder. The goddess walked among them, not often seen and never noisy, her sandals whispering like pages turned in a well-loved book. She guided hands that were carving wood into oars, arguments into laws, fear into theater, grief into music, and she leaned sometimes over the shoulders of weavers who smuggled small owls into their borders as if to remind cloth that thinking is also a kind of shelter. The hill, meanwhile, began to imagine columns, and the columns began to imagine sky. Years would gather there like doves, and stories, too, of a craftsman with waxy dreams, of a boy who ran ahead of his own shadow, of a hero who would one day enter a building that breathes like a riddle and discover how a thread can be stronger than a sword. But that is later. For now, the tree's leaves turn their pale undersides to the afternoon breeze, a whole choir of tiny hands blessing the city below. The spring salt quiets to a reflective pool where children dare their reflections to blink first. And up on the bare rock, where the first decision taught the city its own name, an owl opens and closes its eyes, learning the night's questions before it flies toward a maze that waits, patient and breathing, for the sound of approaching footsteps. Night in the island city moved like a slow animal along the walls, breathing through narrow streets and pausing at doorways to listen to the private metronome of human worry. On the docks, Ropes creaked in their sleep, and masts traced delicate letters against the stars as if writing a message to whoever keeps watch over tide and fate. From the palace, warm with lamps and the perfume of hibiscus that could not quite forget the salt, came rumors with feet, whispered steps that carried grief. Every 9th year, they said, ships must rise from Athens like reluctant swans and drift toward Crete, carrying youths whose eyes were too bright with life to be calm, and girls whose laughter still remembered childhood. The sea learned their names, and the sea was asked to forget them. On the arrival shore towered a building that seemed to be breathing, each corridor like a lung filling with silence and letting it go. It was a maze, but not only of stone, also of dread, also of stories told to frighten children and, in time, to discipline kings. A creature lived at its center, or at least a hunger did, and the world had found a way to simplify its fear into a single shape. Bull-shouldered, man-faced, an argument between two kinds of power that had not learned to share. To answer such a structure, the gods rarely send thunder. They send a person with an ordinary heartbeat and one unusual promise folded somewhere behind the ribs. He arrived with the other tributes, not disguised as anything marvelous, just a young man whose gaze kept returning to the horizon, as if studying how courage gathers itself out there before it walks ashore.
Some said he was a prince, but a prince is only a boy with a city on his shoulders, and boys study fear at the same pace as anyone. The king of the island received them among pillars that kept their own counsel. At his side stood a daughter whose eyes, sharpened by watching the machinery of power from too near, recognized in the newcomer not bravado but a steadiness like a hand on a rudder. Ariadne had learned that a kingdom's smooth floors can hide a great deal of blood. She had also learned to listen for the thin sound hope makes when trying not to be noticed. That sound found her now.
In the courtyard, where the wind rearranged torch smoke into temporary philosophies, they looked at one another and understood that some alliances are less a choice than a discovery. Love would be the loud name given later. What they felt in the first motion was recognition, a memory of someone they had not yet met stepping forward out of a dream. Somewhere beneath them, in rooms that had never seen moonlight, a craftsman's map slept. A design drawn by a mind more curious than kind, clever for the sake of cleverness. Daedalus, patient with angles and enamored of surprise, had knitted stone into a place where even memory could get lost.
He understood that confusion is a shape that can be built. Yet even makers of traps leave small doors open in their blueprints, if only for their own conscience. Ariadne went to him, or to his echo, and returned with a trick that was also a tenderness. A thread, simple as breath, strong as the quiet will to return. She pressed the coil into the young man's palm. The palace lamps made a honeyed coin of it. She showed him how to tie it at the entrance so that the path back would exist, even while he forgot it forward. The sword she gave was almost an afterthought, a silver line of argument to be used if necessary.
Remember, the thread seemed to say, that the way out begins with a small insistence that you do not belong to darkness. The door knew how to close behind him. Doors are proud of that. He stepped into a windless geometry and noticed how stone keeps secrets better than men, how curves can unteach a mind its certainty. The air smelled of old fear and damp straw. His footsteps were polite at first, and then resolute. The thread slid from his hand in a small, whispering river. At intervals, he felt its softness asking him to keep faith with the promise to return. Historians like to argue whether the monster was only a monster, whether the tale hides an older story of famine fed by tribute, whether the bull is a metaphor for a king's appetite, whether labyrinth is just a word for court. Perhaps, too, there was a breathing presence that had never chosen to be what the world required of it. He moved through a hairpin of corridors and then a low chamber where even thoughts had to stoop. He turned left where left felt true and felt the thread graze his knuckles as if to say, I am still here. At last the center revealed itself, not as a throne room, but as a hollow with straw like exhausted sunlight scattered over the floor. The air tilted. A sound arrived, less a roar than a groan from somewhere between grief and rage, as if the idea of being seen hurt. The shape that stepped from the shadow carried everything. The pride of the bull stiff in the neck, the bewilderment of a human gaze that has never been taught gentleness, the smell of confinement. He slowed, because hurry is a kind of disrespect. The sword felt foolish in his hand, a toy brought into a nightmare. The fight came anyway. Necessity has a short temper. Dust leapt up and tried to flee. Walls listened as they always do, hoping to learn a new story. He did not win by strength alone. Strength is noisy and runs out of breath. He won by timing, the intelligence of waiting for the right beat. The way a dancer listens for the drum beneath the drum. When the blade found the tender place where myth forgets to guard itself, the breathing changed and then ended. Silence thickened, and for a moment he felt not triumph but the ache anyone feels after ending a creature's suffering, even a creature that terrifies. He whispered something that might have been a prayer for things that never asked to be born the way they were. Then came the problem that follows most victories, the way home. He was already nearly another person. Battle rearranges the furniture inside. He gathered the thread, and the thread gathered him. Corridor by corridor, the small wisdom led him back through the curve-taut darkness toward air. When at last night put its cool hand on his face, the stars seemed closer than they had ever dared before. Ariadne stood almost within reach of them, her hair remembering wind, her lamp teaching moths the slow dance of devotion. They ran, not flamboyantly, but with that urgent quiet of those who know that dawn sometimes changes its mind about mercy. Down to the ships where oars slept like folded wings. Across decks that smelled of tar and good plans, away from the city that had believed a maze could keep a bargain with fear. On another island they rested, the kind of pause that pretends to be permanent. What happened there is a knot that storytellers cannot quite untie without breaking something. Some say he woke to an empty shore and a crown of stars left by a god who loved dancers. Some say duty called him like a cold wind back to his ship. Some say she wept into the earth until a vine learned her name. Whatever the exact sorrow, a parted shoreline lived in both their memories. The sea does not explain itself. It offers only weather. He sailed on toward a father waiting with a beacon and a misunderstanding. Black sails carried their own argument, and a cliff-leaping grief would teach him what winning can cost. Yet the larger world had shifted. Somewhere in Athens, a mother lit a lamp with oil from a tree that promised patience. Somewhere a child untangled twine and discovered the first geometry of hope. Somewhere a craftsman looked at his tools and wondered whether cleverness might someday learn to serve kindness rather than spectacle. And somewhere, far from the salt and the pillars, a man tuned a lyre and rehearsed a melody he believed could persuade even the stone-hearted to be curious about mercy. The night held its breath. A doorway in the earth waited for a song, and at its threshold, where shadows begin to remember their names, a figure listened for the one note that can teach sorrow to loosen its grip. They said his music could convince rivers to reconsider their paths and teach stones the patience to blossom into listening. In the evenings, when ordinary mortals folded their grief like linens and set it on the shelf for mourning, he would lift the lyre and touch the strings as one touches the brow of a fevered child, and the air itself underwent a soft correction. Orpheus did not speak loudly. He did not need to. A melody rose that behaved like water finding its true level. like light learning how to linger, and the creatures that usually keep their distance, the deliberate tortoises, the suspicious foxes, even trees whose roots already believe they know everything, moved a little closer, as if remembering that attention is a form of love. Thus, when Eurydice fell, some say to the bite of a serpent, some say to the sudden, ungenerous economy of chance, his music did not go wild with rage. It turned inward and grew so clear that it resembled prayer. He went to the border where the earth pretends to end, where cracks in rock show seams of older night. There, the wind, which everywhere else is full of opinions, grew shy. He stepped down. It is not true that the underworld is only terror. It is also administration, an archive kept in cool darkness, a place where every sigh ever exhaled by the living is filed in corridors so long they eventually turn into rumor. He moved through rooms where shadows rehearsed the art of staying. He passed gates whose hinges remembered wars. He crossed a river that held its mirror steady even when grief leaned over it. The ferryman, who prefers silence because words often come to him sticky with excuses, accepted a song for fare, a melody that recalled his first sunrise, years before he had learned the price of passage. On the farther shore, sentries whose duty has made them stern felt their arms grow lighter. One remembered the smell of pine sap on his father's hands and allowed the memory to loosen the knot in his jaw. The place where judges sit and weigh what cannot be weighed, paused, not because the song begged for mercy, but because it returned to them their own earliest hope, the one they had been careful to put away when they learned the math of punishment. Deeper still, to the very hall where gloom is ironed smooth and wears a crown, he came with nothing but strings and breath and the willingness to sound tender in a place that mistrusts tenderness. Persephone, whose face carries the knowledge of seasons, loss and return, hunger and ripeness, drew in her breath slowly as one does when a scent arrives that remembers a childhood orchard. Hades, who has made a profession out of not being surprised, felt something small and antique stir in his chest. The first time he saw a moth escape a room by finding the window that no one else had noticed. They listened. He did not make speeches. He sang the story of two people who had once been surprised by how well their silences fit together, who had learned the grammar of shared evenings, who had discovered the small economies of care that make a life, how her hand, a little cooler than his, taught him to love shade. How his clumsily made table tilted but held. He sang of the day grief arrived like a knife disguised as grass, and of the days after, thirst that water could not drink. The notes took their time. In between them lived the recognition that love's authority is older than law. Even the three who sit at every ending felt a tug on the thread they usually keep so certain.
The bargain that followed is famous for its one clause and for the human shape of that clause. You may lead her back, said the Order of Shadows, but do not turn until she stands beneath the sky. Clever law that, recognizing how the heart, even when favored, can be its own undoing. He thanked them without kneeling. Gratitude is not smaller when it stands. They began the ascent. The path upward is not a staircase, but a long patience. The air warms in increments. The stones forget to echo, and the ear begins to anticipate the tiny, daring noises that belong only to living. The papery sift of leaves, the scratch of a beetle's foot, the near, silent applause of light on dust.
Behind him came the sound he loved most. Not music this time, but the disciplined hush of someone walking carefully, a cadence he could have recognized blindfolded across a crowded festival. He played as they climbed, not to charm the way open, permission had already been given, but to keep his own questions occupied, because the mind has a habit of wandering toward the one door it has been told is locked. Historians argue about what happened in the last stretch. Some say doubt bit him as sharply as any serpent. What if I am leading no one? What if this mercy is a trick? Some say love turned its head the way flowers do toward warmth, unable to endure, not seeing a moment longer. Others say it was neither doubt nor longing, but simply the physics of grief, how absence pulls on the body like a moon on the sea. He turned. The world has not yet finished finishing that turn. In the instant his eyes found her, the law completed its quiet work. The bond unstitched. She slid backward into the well-kept dark with a look not of reproach, but of tender apology, as if to say, "It is not your fault that rules are written to test the strongest part of us and find the weaker." His name broke in his mouth. The note he plucked landed without a place to echo. He raised his hands to the ceiling of earth and felt, for a breathless, inverted moment, the way roots must feel when lightning chooses the ground. Then silence, the kind that decides to be company rather than cruelty, sat down beside him. He did not descend again to bargain. Even love must learn its limits, or it becomes tyrannical and untrue. Instead, he carried her absence gently through the years, like a bowl filled to the brim. He learned to walk so steadily that almost nothing spilled. And in that steadiness, new songs were born, ones that told the truth without scarring the listeners, ones that remembered joy without pretending joy does not end. People argue still whether the tale praises obedience or warns against it, whether the gods demanded an impossible discipline or offered the only fair test. Perhaps both. Perhaps the point is the turn itself, that moment when the future knocks, and we look back anyway, so humanly, because love wishes to confirm what it cannot bear to doubt. His music grew stranger after that, clearer, as if great loss had skimmed off the froth and left only what nourishes. Animals still approached, trees still leaned. Children who didn't like to sleep let his melodies escort them to the border of dream. He avoided the loud places where celebration forgets itself. He preferred riverbanks, edges of fields, clearings where the sky knows how to listen. And yet, even in softer exiles, the world remains a world. There were feasts where cruelty wore festival colors. There were mistakes made by people who thought rhythm could excuse harm. The end that came for him was not sung well by those who caused it, and we will not rehearse their thin song here. Better to say that the lyre, falling into the river that loves to carry everything toward its own sentence, kept playing. The current, which is usually satisfied to mutter to itself, took up the melody and ferried it forward. And somewhere far out, the sea learned the refrain and repeated it at its own tide mark. And even planets, those slow, dignified listeners, tilted the least bit to hear how patience turns sorrow into a companion. On certain twilights, when the wind has nothing urgent to do, you can hear that surviving phrase settle over fields like a calm hand, reminding all who labor that love's failure to conquer death is not love's failure. It is simply the world keeping its oldest proportion. Down in another city, a man stares at a pair of wings he has glued together with hope and warning. A boy beside him, studying air the way a sparrow studies open space, feels adventure's warm breath on his neck. Feathers wait. Wax thinks it has made a friend of the sun. The music, having taught rocks to listen and kings to doubt, drifts toward the open water, where a different kind of lesson is about to lift itself into the pale morning. Morning on the island began as a thin silver thought along the horizon, the kind that visits craftsmen before they rise. In a low room that smelled of beeswax and sea salt, a man with patient hands taught air to accept a bargain. Feathers lay in careful ranks, small to large, each one tested against a breath to see how it confessed its shape. Beside them, a bowl of wax cooled like a tame ember. Daedalus, whose cleverness had once made palaces dream in right angles, and whose skill had, just as easily, taught stone to confuse the feet of heroes, now used that same intelligence to argue with gravity in a gentler tone.
He spoke little, but the quiet around him was articulate, a rasp whispering over wood, the soft click of quills as they found neighbors, the low sigh of wax persuaded into seams. Icarus watched with that bright impatience peculiar to the young, eyes already flying beyond the room, beyond the cliff, into the wideness that begins where maps politely stop. He loved his father, but he loved the idea of sky with an affection that did not yet know how to pace itself. "Not too close to the sea," the father murmured, testing a joint. "For spray will wet the feathers, and your balance will become a quarrel you cannot win. And not too close to the sun, for arrogance is a kind of heat that melts what holds us together." The boy nodded, as sons nod when the lesson behaves like weather, everywhere, unavoidable, and slightly unreal until it turns. Outside, the blue world flexed its shoulder. Gulls stitched brief parentheses in the air. Far inland, the labyrinth exhaled emptily, its appetite finally unfed. Kings recalculated, rumors gathered their skirts. But here, at the edge where rock speaks frankly to space, two figures tried on a different grammar. The straps bit tenderly into Icarus's shoulders. The frame nuzzled his scapula as if choosing allegiance. He lifted his arms, and the wings answered with a rustle like a book making up its mind to be read. First steps were not steps. They were experiments, small trials of trust onto the thin blue surface of nothing. Daedalus rehearsed him gently. How to tilt, how to listen with the whole back, how to borrow wind without frightening it away. The old man himself felt the old thrill. Not pride alone, but the dizzy, useful humility of someone who knows he is about to ask the world for a favor and might, astonishingly, receive it. When they leapt, it was not dramatic. It was tidy, correct, an artisan's signature written on open air. The cliff retreated. The sea, surprised, forgot for a moment to be heavy. Their shadows skimmed the water like careful brushes. Icarus laughed, an untidy sound that startled a school of fish into glittering agreement, and the island behind them softened into myth, as islands often do when you have your back to them. They kept company with the earliest birds, those practical poets of the sky who know 1,000 ways to say, lift. Daedalus pointed with his chin, indicating a corridor of safer currents. Icarus understood, then invented a prettier one and chased it. Freedom is a bright wine. It warms, it emboldens, it also blurs the edge of caution. The boy tasted and wanted another sip. Below, the sea tamed itself into long, thoughtful swells. White lines combed the water's hair. They passed a boat whose single, awed sailor rubbed his eyes with a sunburnt knuckle and promised himself to remember this sight, though memory often edits without permission. The air thinned a little. The sun shouldered upward with its old, unarguable authority. Daedalus called across the distance that wind inserts between warnings and ears. He named again the boundaries, those invisible fences kindness builds around survival. The boy heard roughly half and translated the rest into music. Higher, farther, now. He climbed. The wings rejoiced, and why shouldn't they? They had been made for this argument with emptiness, for this exact negotiation between thrust and grace. Icarus felt his heart's drum declare a festival. He forgot that festivals run on borrowed time. There are always two heats at noon, the good one that ripens figs and forgives mistakes, and the other that tests the stitch in everything. The second heat found the seam where wax, eager to be useful, held feather to feather in a marriage designed for morning but not for eternity. The boy did not notice at first. He was busy discovering a new blue above the old blue.
a color only a handful of creatures ever get to see. A single feather loosened itself and spun past his ear like a friend running late. Then another. The wing sentence began to lose consonants. He felt a tug that was not the wind's. He glanced back and saw the slow unbuttoning, the gentle treachery of melt. Below him, his father's voice frayed into something primal and small, the syllable a parent makes when love finds it has no handholds. Perhaps the boy could have slanted downward then, negotiated with air, begged the sea for a cooler thought. Perhaps the story's spine would have bent and set itself anew, but astonishment has weight. Realization, arriving suddenly, can make the body forget its lessons. He thrashed once, which taught the remaining feathers to panic. He reached for a heat that refused to be a hand. The drop did not begin as a fall. It began as an argument gravity had been patient enough to postpone until it was sure of winning. The sky let him go with the kindness of an elder who knows the cost of stubbornness. Water rose to meet him. A hard blue turned soft at the last instant. And then the sea, who, for all her moods, is not cruel for sport, took him in and closed over him as gently as a mother rearranging a blanket. Silence. Then a ring that widened, then two, and that geometry was the only obituary. Daedalus descended in a grief without theatrics, because true sorrow misplaces its gestures. He landed awkwardly on a shore that did not know their names, and folded the useless wings with the care one gives to objects that have tried their best. He knew the mathematics of blame, but refused to compute it fully. Numbers today were not a language fit for love. He walked the strand as fathers walk when the world has made a hole no tool can mend. And he spoke aloud to a boy who still seemed to be listening. They say he hung the surviving wings in a temple, a confession in the shape of gratitude. They say he lived long enough to teach other lessons to other patient materials. They say, too, that some nights he heard gulls and could not tell whether the cry scolded or sang. The sea went on with its chores, wearing down cliffs, lifting and setting the small boats of men who have to try, and the sun, indifferent as law, lowered itself by evening to a temperature the human heart can stand. As for the boy, stories gave his name to a place where water remembers light too well. Fishermen there still point at a certain sheen on the surface and shake their heads with a fondness that hurts. Children, when they first hear the tale, promise with fierce sincerity to obey their elders. Later, when sky tugs at them with its old blue temptation, they relearn the story at a speed unique to their own blood. Wisdom is slow, wonder is fast. A life is an attempt to braid them. Sometimes the braid holds. Sometimes the sun leans close and asks a question feathers cannot answer. On clear mornings, the wind along that coast still arranges small spirals of down above the rocks, just a handful, turning lazily, rising and falling as if reconsidering, while far out a rumor of wings continues its silent climb toward a brightness that keeps its distance, beautiful as a promise no one can quite keep. By the time the sun had learned the names of all the islands, and the wind had grown tired of carrying warnings, another kind of journey was already underway. The slow journey that does not cross seas so much as it crosses a man. He had many names, but the one that fits like a weathered glove is the one that remembers his labor. Some say he was born with thunder already threading his veins. Others say he was only a large, bewildered kindness forced into the wrong shapes by prophecies and tempers older than law. Hera's anger shadowed his cradle. Fate handed him a strength that could move mountains, but not always move grief. A madness, borrowed from gods who sometimes lend their storms to mortals, tore his house apart, and when it passed, it left a silence so complete that even birds hesitated. He went then to the place where answers wear the sober faces of priests and asked what atonement could be fashioned from brokenness. The reply was not poetry. He must serve a small king, they said, a nervous man in a narrow room, and accept a list of tasks that sounded like the world's version of penance, written in stones and teeth. Thus began 12 slow footsteps. Some count more, some less, for history loves to argue about the arithmetic of redemption. The first step carried him to a valley where a lion had taught fear to growl inside men's chests. The beast's hide refused iron, as if it had bargained with metal for immunity. So the man studied breath instead of blade, listened for the moment when pride opens a small door, and closed his arms around the creature until air became a memory. He wore the skin not as a trophy, but as a reminder that brute problems sometimes require intimate solutions. Next came a marsh, where a many-headed question writhed, and every answer he struck multiplied the asking. The hydra's necks learned to bloom from their own wounds. Only when fire joined the conversation did growth surrender to completion. His nephew's torch kissed each stump to stillness. Later, the record keepers would murmur that help disqualifies a triumph, that the second task did not count because a boy's steady hand had held flame. But who among us is saved alone? A third labor asked for speed that would not break tenderness. A golden-horned hind belonged to a goddess who dislikes theft and remembers trespass. He followed the deer through seasons until he could lift it without injury, because victory that harms the beloved object is only a complex failure. Then there was the boar who had made winter a season of panic. Driven into snowdrifts by patience rather than fury, it was bound and brought, a demonstration that sometimes the trap is a circle traced by waiting. In the stables of a king whose pride was measured in filth, he considered shovels and refused them. He opened a door for rivers instead, and let water do what water does well, carry away what the strong pretend does not belong to them. Some say he bargained for pay, and so the task was cancelled. Some say the streams applauded, and the cattle, relieved, learned to breathe. In a forest where birds honed metal in their mouths and dropped it like small, cruel rain, he raised a rattle, bronze clattering like thunder's child, and fear itself became a broom. The flock rose and fled into a more honest sky. A bull on an island pawed at the surf. A king's boasting turned into an inconvenience. He grasped the creature's horns the way one takes hold of a thought that has outgrown its usefulness and led it, panting, back to the shore. Man-eating mares, taught to mix appetite with command, met a lesson in reversal. Their owner tasted the habit he had forced on them, and the horses, cured by a single terrible clarity, quieted. Across a sea of talking waves, he sailed for a girdle promised to a queen whose kingdom tempered strength with conversation. Some say she would have given it freely. That peace was possible until fear whispered lies among the men, and swords, once drawn, insisted on applause. Farther still, where an island gleamed with the blood-red afternoon of long distances, he wrestled not only with a giant of threefold swagger, but with the long fatigue of travel. The cattle he led away remembered the way home better than he did. The road measured his patience step by step. Near the edge of the world, if the world can be said to have an edge that is not merely a new beginning, he reached for apples that are actually questions disguised as fruit. The Hesperides sang like gardens in late light. A dragon kept accounts in coils. He borrowed the shoulders of a titan for a while, holding heaven as one holds a sleeping child, arms trembling but willing. When Atlas returned, he tried to leave him with the sky. Strong men are often trusted too easily, but a trick of politeness saved him, and the apples rode hidden among his ordinary belongings. The final step led down, not up, into the disciplined gloom of a kingdom that keeps the end tidy. There he learned what even heroes learn when they visit thresholds guarded by laws older than courage, that strength must ask permission, that companions matter, that even a hound of many names can be guided by a leash braided from necessity and respect. He did not draw blood. He merely proved that guardians can be courted by firmness without hatred. He brought the creature to daylight, then returned it without gloating, because victory that humiliates leaves a stain. Along the way there were side errands. Parerga, those little labors that travel with large ones the way sparrows travel with oxen. Freeing a friend pinned to a rock by an eagle's daily argument. Lifting a city's curse by reminding it how to laugh. Yoking shores together with boulders so that love could find shorter paths. Historians still debate the count. Was the Hydra discounted? Were the stables disallowed? And whether the hero's life belongs to ethics or to spectacle.
But in the nights between tasks, when his hands smelled of pine pitch and river, he learned the quiet arithmetic of atonement, that guilt can be shaped into usefulness, that sorrow can be persuaded to row instead of drown, that the mind must grow gentler than the muscles if one wishes to sleep without armor. Kings who sent him out learned to hide under tables when he returned. Queens who met him learned that strength can be shy. Children who saw him pass learned to name their own small chores with a little more ceremony. The lion's pelt weathered into a second skin. The club, which in lesser hands would have been only a threat, became a staff for long walking. Sometimes he raged, as all the mighty do, at trickery that moved the goalposts and at gods who demanded corrections, as if his life were a document to be endlessly revised. Sometimes he laughed, and the air forgave him for frightening it. When at last the list lay quiet, completed as much by patience as by sinew, he stood for a long time on a hill outside a city that had forgotten how to be unafraid, and looked at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The stories would go on without asking his permission. Bards would turn bruises into meter and set to music the slap of river on stone. But for one moment he was only a man who had paid with his back and been paid with a little peace.
If you lean into certain twilights, you can hear the rhythm of those footsteps still, a dozen, maybe more, fading into acceptance. And above, where clouds practice the etiquette of feasts, a long table is being laid. Cups are polished until they capture small suns, and a clear, sweet drink that tastes like afternoons waits in bowls of light. Someone lifts one, smiling, as if the sky itself were preparing to toast the end of toil and the beginning of a gentler quarrel called celebration.
On the mountain whose shoulders borrow their whiteness from old winters, and whose brow sleeps level with the first Sirius stars, there is a hall that breathes like a warm lung in the cold. The doors do not creak because wood here has learned to age without complaint, and the floors remember with affection the soft thunder of sandals. Those who gather inside are not merely powerful, they are practiced at being looked at, and so their gestures have the slow precision of ceremony. The table runs as long as a river dream, and along it are set bowls that hold a light sweet enough to be tasted, cups that remember hands centuries later, plates that have heard the first jokes of the world and still smile. Nectar waits in a tall vessel that never empties in public. Ambrosia rests upon leaves that look as if dawn has just thought of them. A mild music occupies the corners, the kind that leaves conversation free to wander. The graces have braided it with laughter, and the muses, in an unhurried generosity, have loosened their hair so that inspiration can walk about as if it were ordinary air.
He who arranges storms sits at the head, not in tyranny, but in habit. Thunder asleep beneath his ribs like a familiar hound. Hera beside him inhabits her dignity, the way a queen wears time. The lines at the edges of her mouth are not only sternness, but also the roadmaps of 1,000 reconciliations. Athena arrives with pupils that hold the reflection of distant fires, the human sort tended carefully, and a certain clean smell of olive wood and new parchment. If she speaks, it is with the crispness of a blade that remembers mercy. Across the table, Ares taps a finger, impatient with peace, but, tonight, persuaded by the deep ease of company. The metal in his voice softens when Hephaestus lifts a cup for him, and for a moment, the truce between injury and pride feels as permanent as mountain stone. Aphrodite moves the air without moving at all. People accuse beauty of idleness, but anyone who has watched her greet a room knows how much work it takes to make affection feel inevitable.
She gives one half smile to the Sea Lord, whose eyes are always part storm and part rescue. Poseidon, courteous in his own tidal fashion, inclines his head, remembering a temple's salt prayer, remembering also that water is asked to bless both voyages and returns, and that sometimes it must choose. Demeter sits with hands that smell faintly of warm earth and cut straw, her grief braided and unbraided as seasons dictate. She breaks a piece of bread, and the crumbs seem to germinate where they fall. Hestia, who prefers hearth to thunder, keeps the room's temperature exactly where voices are brave but not loud.
Artemis inhabits a small province of shadow near an open arch, where night leans in to listen. Her attention carries the coolness of pine shade and the moral clarity of moonstone. Apollo across from her glows as if a polite son were sitting for a portrait, promising medicine and music in equal drafts, and occasionally raising an eyebrow at the lyre when a conversational lull needs mending. Hermes arrives late in the timeless way messengers do, with dust from 10 borders still considering his ankles and a smile that understands the humor in impossible errands. Dionysus is the most relaxed of them, but even he holds his ease like a tool. Intoxication in his care is a pedagogy. He would teach mortals that letting go can be an art instead of an accident. Lesser immortals attend with the grace of those who know the power of being almost invisible, the hours pacing the light so that the feast never sours, Hebe refilling where joy has been honest, Ganymede pouring with that shy handsomeness that taught eagles to be tender for once. There are quarrels, of course, but they travel tonight like old dogs allowed under the table, acknowledged, fed scraps, kept from biting. The talk moves as slowly as nectar, then quickens when history's oddities are mentioned, then settles again into that benevolent boredom only the secure can afford. Someone asks, as someone always does, whether mortals are learning anything by the long experiment called living. Athena mentions a city trying to measure justice without misplacing mercy. Hermes reports a marketplace where fairness has been seen bargaining with cunning and occasionally winning. Demeter notes girls teaching their grandmothers to plant beans in new patterns because the weather has changed the rules without warning.
Ares grunts that courage is respectable even when it is wrong-headed. Artemis remarks that tenderness toward animals is the first rehearsal for tenderness toward the weak. Hephaestus, who has earned the right to be silent, instead tells a brief story about a lame boy who learned the patience of metal and thereby taught his village to stop laughing. The cup comes round again, and with it that warm amnesty the gods grant themselves for ancient errors. Even Zeus, whose decisions wear armor, allows the childlike hope that utility might someday reconcile itself with beauty. Outside, the winds practice scales. Inside, gossip arranges itself into mythology. It is not all sweetness.
The feast is a monarchy of appetite, and appetite sometimes forgets table manners. Hermes observes, with a glance at Aphrodite and Ares,
that desire remains the most persuasive diplomat and the least reliable ally. Hera's look can chill wine. Apollo, reminded of a priest who would not listen, plucks a string whose note implies that truth resists ownership. Artemis's wolf, just beyond the threshold, huffs an amen. Poseidon consents to a story about a drowned city and insists he was not in a temper. The company smiles the way families do when they have agreed to a fiction for the sake of peace. Dionysus turns a little water into wine to make a point about joy being more than fermentation. Hephaestus passes around a hinge so perfect that everyone becomes briefly silent, remembering that the world opens and closes all day on inventions whose makers are seldom invited to the head table. The subject of fate crosses the linen like a draft. Shoulders tense, then relax when someone makes a small joke about scissors learning to yawn. In the rafters, the owl blinks, counting errors with mercy. What good is such a banquet, say the severe, when the world below still limps? The answer is in the way the room holds variety without panic, in the way nectar tricks immortality into sounding almost like gratitude, in the way laughter here contains a seed of law. Agreements are made not to dominate, but to keep company together. Mortals who pray for feasts imagine glut. The gods who have known too much of plenty value proportion. A single cup, refilled exactly when needed. A single loaf, endlessly satisfying because no one tries to hide hunger.
Somewhere near the hall's edge, a chair is kept empty without explanation. Sometimes a hero sits there, dazed by the altitude of praise. Sometimes a poet is allowed to dream in it long enough to carry a better metaphor home. Tonight it is left for the notion that even the high table must welcome something beyond itself. Call it mystery, call it consequence, call it the uninvited guest who points out the bill waiting under the plate. And always, beneath the jokes and the pedigrees, a weather of listening endures, to thunder's nap, to olive leaves rehearsing in the mind, to hammers cooling, to surf repeating its long apology. When at last the last cup is lifted and the last low song of the night is breathed into the beams, the doors lean open to let the great air in. Stars wait like servants who have outlived all masters. Far below, on a smaller table made of planks that remember storms, a ship is being named softly. Its timbers, salted into wisdom, seem to lean toward the constellations as if hearing instructions. On the prow, a carved face almost speaks. The sea holds its breath. In the hush between cup and voyage, a crew gathers, not yet famous, listening for a rumor only the sky can give. How to leave, how to seek, how to come home with something the world did not know it needed. They built her from timbers that remembered wind in their sap, from planks that had practiced listening while they were still trees. In the shipyard, among curls of shavings and the patient gossip of mallets, the hull took on a shape that implied intention, forward, always forward, though without hurrying. They named her for speed, yes, but also for the nimble wisdom of a hand that knows how to hold without crushing. The prow bore a face carved from wood that had once stood in the groves of an oracle. If rumor is to be trusted, that figurehead could hear the grammar of currents and translate the small advice of waves. And sometimes, when the night admitted confidences, she whispered back. Men gathered not merely for fame, but because the thought of leaving and returning with a better story had already set up camp in their sleep. One brought oarsmanship as steady as a heartbeat, another brought fists, a third cunning, a fourth songs. A fifth carried grief folded small in his pocket, as if to keep it from frightening the others. They were not saints. They were the sort who quarrel in low voices, and then, remembering the distance to the horizon, nod and set their backs to the same task. On the day of departure, the sea put on its most conversational blue. Gulls wrote elliptical blessings above them. The rope slipped from the mooring stone with a sigh like a tight throat deciding to speak. The first pull of oars felt like a promise the body makes to time. We will keep pace if you will keep patience. Wind caught them, not as a conqueror but as a colleague, and the sail rose like agreement. From the headland, mothers raised hands. Blessing or warning, no one could say. The gesture looks the same at a distance. The city diminished to a line, then a thought, then a rumor, and what remained was the water's quiet arithmetic, horizon dividing by two and never reaching zero. They had a task, pinned to their map like a golden moth, a fleece that shone with the color of afternoons, guarded by spells and greed on a shore whose name tasted of metal. Was it worth it, this long corridor of toil, for a pelt made sacred by stories? Historians argue still, measuring cost against glitter, but the crew knew that quests are not receipts, they are schools. The first lessons came quickly. At Lemnos they learned that grief can turn a whole island inward, that the politeness of guests is a kind of healing, and that staying too long where flattery flourishes robs a voyage of its edge. Orpheus calmed the oars with a rhythm that made effort feel like ceremony. His music was a lamp set in the prow, inviting darkness to show its friendlier face. In a narrow strait where cliffs practice the art of collision, the ship listened harder than men could, and at the last moment she leaned just a little so that the water's fist struck air instead of oak. They cheered not loudly but with relief, which is the quietest triumph. When a king demanded trials he himself could not have endured, strength answered, and when a blind prophet begged for pity, pity answered, and both answers were counted as navigation. Every harbor instructed them in a different verb: a barter, mend, refuse, forgive. They quarreled with the wind as lovers quarrel, swearing to leave and then turning back with a softer face. Nights were a school of their own. The sky spread its careful grammar once more, and the ship, whose ears were carved from holy wood, liked to murmur names of stars to the helmsman. There, counsel, there, caution, there, remember the reef of pride. In the quiet after second watch, men told the ship their private sentences, about fathers who never softened, about debts paid in smaller coins than honor, about women who could turn a town square into a sanctuary by laughing. The prow listened and did not gossip. And then the river with many throats and one intention brought them inland toward a city that kept its doors fastened with magic as much as with iron. Colchis lay ahead like a quarrel no one had finished phrasing. The fleece hung not only from a branch, but from the idea of reward itself, shining, defended, woven through with the pride of a king who believed possession could become permanence. He set tasks sharper than teeth: plow with fire-breathing bulls, sow a field with dragon's teeth and harvest warriors, then persuade a serpent whose patience had been weaponized to let go. The crew, who had learned to be plural, looked to their captain. The captain looked to the carved face that had been listening all along. The face, wise in the way wood becomes when it has survived many winters, did not nod. Wood seldom nods, but the grain along the jawline seemed to deepen, like a path being remembered. Help arrived not as thunder, but as a young woman with a mind like a well-honed knife and a heart negotiating against the treasury of her father's house. Medea knew herbs the way sailors know wind. She understood that courage without strategy is merely appetite-wearing armor. She spoke in the low voice of someone used to having her ideas adopted without her name, and she made a pact with the voyage itself rather than with any particular man. Fire can be taught manners for a little while, she said, if salves are honest and timing exact. Teeth sewn into furrows will sprout what they must, but even born fighters know how to turn on one another if a hand throws a stone at the right instant. As for sleep, she knew a branch that could bend a serpent's eyelids downward if stroked correctly, because even guardians tire of their own vigilance. Nothing in her counsel promised ease. Everything promised precision. They went at dusk, when the world trades a little sharpness for a little beauty. The bulls came with breath that braided flame and smoke, and the man, shielded by preparation as much as by bravery, set the plow in, wearing patient pain like a shirt. Sparks climbed him but failed to make a home. The field received its false seed with a hiss. When the armed seedlings rose, men knitted from warning rather than from womb. He threw among them something like a question, and their blades debated one another into silence. At the grove, the serpent uncoiled like a river remembering its spring. It lifted a head heavy with duty and began to sway, and the song Medea hummed was not trickery, but permission to rest. The lids lowered. The treasure, which was only wool and also not only wool, came down into human hands and felt a little foolish, as all objects do when they realize the stories around them have been louder than their substance. Flight, then, always flight. Kings rarely forgive clarity. The ship leapt into herself and ran. Pursuit dragged long shadows across the water. Choices sharpened, sometimes cruelly, to buy another hour of future with a coin minted from the past.
The sea keeps all treaties eventually, but not always immediately. Bargains were struck that no singer enjoys reciting. What matters is that dawns began again to carry the taste of home. Islands that had once been rumors put on names. The old headlands dressed themselves in recognition. In narrow places the hull leaned as before, trusting the low speech of currents more than the shout of human fear. Friends were left ashore with more years in their hair and better jokes. Enemies learned to grumble in a quieter key. When at last the harbor of beginning received them again, it was with that complicated embrace the familiar gives the changed. Pride, suspicion, welcome, accounting.
The fleece, blessed, troublesome, soft as any afternoon, was held up and then put away, as all trophies must be if life is to go on. What remained, and what mattered, was the habit of listening the voyage had taught them, to water, to wood, to one another, to the difference between speed and haste. Men returned to smaller tasks with greater reverence. Menders found they were heroes after all. Helmsmen learned to sit at kitchen tables without needing a tiller in their hands. As for the ship, she settled at her mooring and dreamed. Yes, ships dream of straits that had tried to close and of songs that had kept them open. On windless afternoons, a child might press an ear to her flank and hear a faint, sea-worn counsel. Keep your thread, mind your oars, take help when it is offered, and when the current speaks, lean. Far off, on a hillside where stone remembers thunder, an owl turned its head toward the west, and the evening star rehearsed the old route across the darkening page, as if marking the margin where the next chapter waits with its quiet breath. Long after the ship's wake had braided itself back into the common grammar of the sea, another journey began in a quieter key. Not with oars and shouted timing, but with a young man standing at the edge of his mother's safety, listening to how rumor sharpens into obligation. Perseus had grown on an island that understood refuge, where the nets were mended with patience and stories were folded and set aside like clean linen. Yet refuge is an agreement with time, not a guarantee. One day, a petty man with a king's latitude demanded a bride and found refusal in a gaze too honest to flatter him. Power, embarrassed, points elsewhere. So a task was set like a trap disguised as praise. Bring me a marvel that frightens even its own reflection. The name whispered was Gorgon, and behind the name, a fact, hair that has learned to hiss,
a stare that rehearses stone. He did not ask for it. He accepted it, the way a shore accepts waves it did not invite. Help does not always arrive in the loud uniforms of rescue. Sometimes it is a clear-eyed woman whose attention trims a problem to its living edge. Sometimes it is a messenger whose sandals remember every shortcut Shadow knows. Athena's hand laid a shield in his arms, polished to a steadiness that could hold a sky without trembling. Do not look directly, her silence advised, for bravery that insists on staring is only vanity in armor. Use the world's own gentleness against it. Reflect, deflect, let light do the dangerous seeing for you. Hermes set a blade in his other hand, curved like a question, balanced like a thought finally finished, and loosened the straps on a pair of winged sandals that understood both upward and away. There would be more, a sack that could persuade impossibility to fit, a cap that taught the eye to forget. But first, knowledge, a road that leads to other roads.
Northward, where the sand remembers glaciers and the wind keeps counsel with ravens, he found the gray, 3 sisters who shared a single eye the way some families share one stubborn habit. Their cave tasted of salt and old caution. He spoke gently, as one does to women who have seen too much and prefer riddles to revelation. When they offered him the common eye to bargain with the world, he took it briefly, not greedily, and in the pause where panic tried to form, he traded courtesy for information. Where do the nymphs keep their helpful hoard? Which path avoids the boredom of doom? They told him, not because he frightened them, but because he treated their sight as a responsibility rather than a prize. And when he gave the eye back, he did not smudge it with triumph. The nymphs received him as trees receive rain long promised. They placed in his keeping what stories always list with a certain ceremonial pleasure. The sandals that make air a floor, the cap that unnames, the pouch that says yes to what should be too large, a draught whose scent remembers sleep. Armed with kindness converted into tools, he rose from cliff to cloud and carried on where maps grew coy. The world below arranged itself into patient designs, fields like chessboards that refuse to hurry the endgame, rivers correcting hills, villages in the shade of skepticism, and above it all the wind read his intent and kept from arguing. He learned to look only at sky and at the disk he held as if it were a moon caught in his palm. Within that patient brightness, the world reversed itself into safer truth. Rocks became smudges, dangers rehearsed backward. He practiced the art that parents wish for their children, and rulers rarely master, the art of not staring at what would turn the heart hard. At the edge of the Western Ocean, where twilight lingers as if reluctant to leave work undone, he found the garden whose keeper had made fright into a profession. Medusa slept, or more precisely, she rested within the habit that constant wariness carves. The air around the place had learned to be careful. Birds avoided it with crooked flights. Statues stood in poses chosen by terror rather than by craft, their marble remembering breath. He did not despise her. Pity arrived uninvited, the kind that recognizes how monsters are often sculpted by long echoes of harm. But pity is not the argument that saves. Attention is. He moved by reflection alone, letting the shield's patient lake show him a life in reverse. Where her hair hissed, the mirror hummed. Where her eyes might have demanded stone, the polished world refused to comply. He measured the distance as a carpenter measures twice and cuts once. When the blade found its work, it was a mercy done in the grammar of necessity, quick, exact, without boasting. The head, which could not forget its power, learned the modesty of a pouch. The body, released, answered the earth with a thud that was not victory's shout, but a tired full stop. Even in ending, she gave birth to astonishment.
Pegasus, startled from the blood like a word the tongue had kept hidden too long, lifted his white sentence into the surprised sky, and Chrysaor followed with a brightness like coin made honest by labor.
The wind, knowing how to keep a secret, folded the moment into itself and hurried him away. For death does not end a hunt if a king has invested pride in the chase. Sisters woke. Rage remembered its legs. Bronze whispered murder. He vanished into motion, the cap persuading sight to misplace him, the sandals teaching cliff and cloud how to become stepping stones. On the road home, he found a country whose shoreline had been bribed by cruelty, a father compromised by fear, a daughter nailed to rock by the logic of other men's bargains, a sea rehearsing appetite at the base of the cliff.
Andromeda's eyes held the sober light of those who have discovered that innocence is not an argument the world always hears. He did not bring speeches. He brought the same habit of attention that had spared his soul in the garden. He bargained with air and angles, and when the monster rose, a shape the sea had been rehearsing since storms learned their verbs, he answered it with the head he did not look at, letting horror encounter its own fact. Stone practiced its old trick. Water, momentarily thoughtful, wrapped itself around a new statue. Silence applauded. Then the cliff remembered how to be a threshold instead of a sentence.
He unbound her as one untangles a long grief, slowly, checking the skin for any place where rope had taught flesh to doubt itself. Those who had arranged her danger arrived late with explanations. Explanations, as usual, did not impress the rescued. He set his course toward the place where the insult had been spoken in the first place. The petty king's mouth, on seeing the traveler return with what was meant to be his ruin, practiced another shape called fear, disguised as fury. There are fractures that cannot be argued with. Some hearts prefer marble. Again the sack opened. Again the world stiffened into its lesson. Again he refused to gloat over statues that used to be men. He asked only for his mother's safety and the permission to give away what remained. Gifts have their proper homes. The blade, having served thought, would serve others. The sandals must continue to argue with distance. As for the mirror shield, he polished it clean of the nightmare it had tricked and lifted it like gratitude toward the woman who had trusted him with a gentler form of courage. Athena received the head as one receives a fierce tool that will be used to keep widows from new grief. She set it where only justice would need to look. The shield on its peg remembered stars. The island returned to its older habit of kindness. The rescued learned the quiet mathematics of ordinary days. Perseus, for his part, remained a man in love with proportion, neither drunk on power nor allergic to action. He understood, as few do, that looking indirectly is not cowardice when the direct gaze would petrify what it means to be human. Some nights he dreamt of the garden and woke with the taste of iron in his mouth. On those mornings he walked to the shore and let the wind file the edge from memory. Fishermen told children that if you hold a well-polished bowl at arm's length and watch the sky inside it, you can learn the weather of tomorrow without losing your way today. Far away, under mountains that sleep like old beasts and breathe in sparks, a forge glowed with its own slow sunrise. A limp and a laugh approached the anvil, and the hammers, patient, persuasive, already counting out the rhythm of new necessities, lifted to meet a future that needed hinges more than heroes, and masks that could turn fear back into craft. The forge did not roar, it breathed, slowly as a sleeping animal might when the dream turns sweet, and the mountain above it wore a dusting of ash like quiet snow. In those caverns, where stone listens better than men, and fire keeps its promises without needing applause, he worked with a patience that has learned the price of haste. A limp marked his gait, yes, but only the unobservant mistook it for weakness. It was simply the body's way of remembering a fall and the long negotiations with pain that followed. Hephaestus arrived at his bench each dawnless hour as if entering a chapel whose hymns were hammers. Tap, settle, sing, tap, settle, sing. Sparks lifted like brief constellations to practice the alphabet of light before they died. The anvil, oldest altar, absorbed every argument and gave back music. He did not waste words. Metal hears differently than flesh. It respects touch more than talk. Under his hands are confessed its secrets, veins of stubbornness, pockets of old fury, seams where patience would be required if beauty was to be persuaded out of the dull red glow. Bellows, solemn as oxen, learned to inhale with him. Tongs became extra fingers. The quench bucket held its breath the way a listener does when a story is entering its delicate part. Outside, the world above played its louder dramas, feasts and jealousies, heroes parading their bruises, sailors bargaining with winds. Inside, transformation kept a quieter schedule, turning raw into right. He made hinges that taught doors to behave like courtesies instead of barriers. He made pots that understood stew as a sacrament. He made plowshares that taught soil the grammar of generosity. For the bright ones he fashioned marvels, nets that folded deceit without cutting, chains whose links remembered mercy and could be loosened when tempers cooled, armor that did not forget the warm, vulnerable animal beneath. Some pieces bore stories no bard could carry alone, a shield whose surface was a city breathing, markets and trials, weddings and mourners, dogs asleep under tables, so that the wearer remembered what he claimed to protect before he lifted his hand. When a certain warrior came with requests spoken in the old, impatient accent of glory, Hephaestus listened, as a physician listens to symptoms and prescribed proportion, strength tempered by weight, brilliance tempered by shadow, a helm that allowed not only seeing but thinking. The work glowed under his care until even the impatient felt their own speed slow to match the beat of the hammers, that sound like a heart correcting itself. His companions were not silent. Lame things have comrades, a three-legged stool that never wobbled, a cracked mug that kept heat better than any perfect cup, a small automaton of bronze that fetched tools with a faint, ticking courtesy, as if time itself had chosen to be kind. Around him moved assistants whose hands had learned the intimate dialect of heat, Charis with her calm wrists, Caberoi with their low, joking competence, Cyclopes whose single gaze never wandered from the line where edge becomes song. They spoke in half-phrases and nods, each understanding when metal is listening and when it must be left alone to think. Sometimes visitors came down the long passage smelling of court, perfume over anxiety, swagger over confusion. They brought complaints that had learned to dress as commissions. A husband wanted chains that would humiliate a wife's lover. Hephaestus raised an eyebrow the way a lock raises its ward and delivered a net so fine it tangled the guilty and the self-satisfied in equal measure, exposing not only betrayal but the theater around it. Laughter rose, but he did not laugh. Tools are not jokes. Later, perhaps, a different visitor arrived with the shame of having been a jest, and the smith's reply was not scorn, but a clasp, a hinge, a device that let doors close gently, because even gods need kinder endings. At other times, a mother brought a child's broken toy, wooden horse with a leg snapped where joy had been too earnest, and he repaired it with inordinate care, pinning the joint with a sliver of bronze polished until it blushed. She left without quite understanding why her throat had tightened. He returned to the anvil with a small, private smile, as if soot and tenderness belonged to the same alphabet.
The mountain remembers quarrels too, and he was no stranger to them.
Once he had fallen from the clean table of the sky. Some call it punishment, some an argument thrown too hard, and the sea had received him as only the sea knows how. First indifferent, then curious, finally adoptive. From her he learned the patience of tides, which do not sulk when rocks resist. From the volcano's throat he learned that anger, if kept below the lid, can become labor. Steam is not fury, merely breath under pressure finding work. So when a throne had to be taught humility, he crafted a chair of such cunning that pride sat down and discovered itself held by invisible reasons.
The rescue was a lesson masquerading as spectacle. Apologies traveled the hall. Gratitude found its old seat, and he, limping, smoky, self-possessed, returned to the only applause he trusted, which is the hiss when hot iron meets water and becomes more itself by cooling. He loved Aphrodite in the way practical men love miracles, stunned, careful, privately certain that beauty is a kind of cleverness. And the marriage stitched together by politics and whimsy became a classroom none of them had requested. She was the grammar of desire, fluent and tireless. He was the grammar of making, patient and exacting.
Could such alphabets co-author a sentence? Some days, yes. A clasp laid like a kiss at the nape of a goddess. A girdle whose secret was not enchantment, but fit. A jewel that did not imprison light, but taught it to play. Other days sharpened themselves into rumor, and the forge filled with a sound not of hammer, but of wounded laughter. He worked anyway. Work was his treaty with sorrow. When the world needed bridges, he taught rivers to hold hands with banks. When it needed cages, he tried to make them honest. When it needed freedom, he built keys. Mortals came too. Not in person, for the climb would blister most feet, but in the form of needs carried by prayer. A crippled boy who wanted a brace that did not insult him. A widow who wanted a stove that remembered thrift. A village that wanted a bell whose note would persuade quarrels to adjourn before knives remembered their old music. He answered as often as the mountain's breath allowed. Some nights, when the fire rested like a tame animal at his feet, he thought about the difference between art that flatters power and craft that serves life. Why do the vain always demand wonder, while the weary ask only for tools that don't fail? Which makes a better world, a chariot that dazzles or a hinge that never complains? The questions settled into the ash, glowing a little. Stories have a habit of knocking just when one grows comfortable. And so, one evening, footsteps approached that carried the rhythm of penance and favor, pride and apology braided awkwardly together. A queen, a bride, a mother walked there in rumor. A youth born in the wrong light needed a path. A city wanted gates that would refuse monsters without frightening refugees. Hephaestus listened with his head bent as if to the metal rather than the petitioner. Then he set out iron and gold, charcoal and patience, and designed what the world could carry without becoming cruel. The hammer said yes, the bellows said amen. Far above, dawn adjusted its robe on a ridge, but down in the forge there is only the hour of making, which belongs to no clock. Sparks flew, the mountain held its breath, and a new thing, patient and proportioned, took on its first shy shine. If you have ever opened a door that swung so cleanly you smiled before remembering to be worried, perhaps you have met him. If a pot has ever simmered exactly the story your hunger wanted to hear, if a wheel has rolled truer than your doubts, if a ring has fit like forgiveness, then somewhere, under ash and echo, a limping god has nodded once and returned to the fire, where he keeps turning pain into hinges and teaching thunder how to hold a cup without spilling. The quarrel did not arrive with shouting. It drifted into a feast the way a moth wanders into lamplight. Small and almost innocent until you notice the shadow it brings. the marriage of a sea-bright goddess and a mortal whose name would be remembered chiefly for the guests it gathered had filled the high places with song, harps that sounded like clear water on stone, cups brimming with a sweetness that made even the stern smile. Hephaestus, soot still soft along his wrist, had sent hinges that would not betray a door, bracelets that taught light to behave like a tame river, and a simple brazier whose glow could hold a circle of friends against the chill. For once, nearly everyone had been invited. Nearly, the goddess who presides over irritation, Eris, whose steps travel where harmony grows complacent, found her name absent from the list and answered in her profession's grammar. She rolled a small, gleaming thing into the center of the laughter. It was an apple, gold as late afternoon, inscribed with the tidy cruelty of 3 words, "To the fairest." A fruit can be ordinary or it can be a mirror. This one chose to be both, and the room adjusted around it as rooms do when jealousy wakes. 3 pairs of eyes, each with its own weather, settled on the little sun. Hera's gaze carried the weight of corridors and treaties, the empire of households. Athena's, the cool, exacting attention of thought that has practiced discipline. Aphrodite's, the soft but undeniable authority of the heart's grammar. None would step back. To the listening mountains and the patient sea, the scene must have seemed almost comic, immortals bent by a trinket. But mortals know how small things open great doors. A misplaced word, an unchecked rumor, a choice made inwardly where no witness can argue. Their host did not wish to judge. Kings are seldom brave enough to adjudicate beauty within their own hall. So the apple rolled forward, tugging them toward a different courtroom, one where simpler eyes might pretend to be neutral. Hermes, with the bothersome ease of those accustomed to errands that complicate the future, was sent to fetch a shepherd who did not know yet that he was royal twice over, born noble, raised among hills, trained by quiet to admire what endures. Paris kept sheep on Ida's slopes, where time perfumes the wind, where stones learn patience from centuries of hooves. When the sudden visitors found him, he was measuring the afternoon with mild contentment, the tilt of sunlight on the wool, the long thoughtfulness of shade, the way a ew's trust arrives slowly, like rain agreed upon by clouds. He blinked at the splendor arriving in his simple pasture. The 3 stood before him, and each, in her own language, asked him to read the inscription's riddle aloud and answer it with a single gesture. He was not stupid. He had the intelligence of fields, unhurried, clear when asked. But being asked to choose among different species of power is like asking a river to be a mountain for an afternoon. Hera went first, not out of arrogance, but out of practice. She named what she could make of him: scepters, cities kneeling politely, corridors where his word would be the weather. It was a heavy offer, decent in its way, and it rustled like the robes of queens entering rooms where men correct themselves mid-sentence. Athena named a different kingdom, victories earned by understanding, courage that answers only to necessity, a mind trained to be its own garrison. She spoke of fame that does not rot, of applause that sounds like the inner yes of work well done. Then Aphrodite did very little speaking. She merely allowed the air to remember what it is like to be chosen by a look that seems to have been waiting since before you were born. She promised not power, but presence, the love of the most beautiful woman breathing, a home in the silence 2 people make when they feel entirely seen. Historians have inked and re-inked the rest. Poets whisper that the goddess of love never truly loses when mirrors are placed on a table. Paris held the apple and felt it warming in his hand as if listening for his pulse. If he chose rule, he would live in rooms that smell of calculation. If he chose war's glory, he would carry a shining loneliness. If he chose beauty, He would live among the domestic weathers of a single astonishing face and the civic storms it attracts. Choice is always partly self-portrait. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. The hillside did not applaud. A breeze moved as breezes do, uncommitted to outcomes. Somewhere a lamb stumbled, then righted itself. The other two did not scream. They do not scream. Their silence braided itself into promises the world would feel later as weather called war and counsel called conspiracy. Favor, once awarded, collects interest.
The goddess of love, in the genial ruthlessness of her office, led him down a road paved with introductions. In a city across the water, a woman had been practicing the art of making grace look easy. She had learned to carry a palace like a shawl and to walk past her own reflection without falling in love with the image. Helen's beauty is said to have been a public resource and a private burden. Her husband, who wore kingship like a yoke he found more comfortable than love, had stored his tenderness in an old chest marked duty. When Paris arrived, the room rearranged itself around a new axis only the two of them could see. He did not conquer. He offered recognition. She did not swoon. She answered an old ache. Even now, scholars set out careful arguments about consent and spell, about abduction and elopement, about gods who press mortals into unwitting roles. Truth, difficult as always, probably sits somewhere in the blended middle where desire and inevitability pretend to be strangers. Ships were seized, or perhaps merely invited. Sails rose as quickly as excuses. And the sea, which has conveyed every kind of human folly and grace, entertained this one as well. Back in the city that had taught law to the world, even as it practiced exceptions, men beat their chests and counted spears.
Oaths, once exchanged lightly over wine, woke in the night with sharp teeth. The summons went around the peninsula like a rumor growing armor. Come, reclaim, correct. Some answered from honor, some from boredom, some from the quiet convenience of aligning their ambitions with a fashionable injury. And so, slowly at first, and then as if a sluice had been opened, a world set itself towards siege. The apple's path had become a road for armies. On Ida, sheep learned new routes around discarded armor. In Sparta, looms paused while women stared through walls, as if walls could become windows by willpower. In Troy, towers practiced holding their breath. And yet, before the shouting, there were still evenings when elders told children that apples bruise easily and that carelessness is a form of cruelty. There were still markets where a fig seller smiled to himself at the absurdity of kings undone by fruit. Philosophy took its notes. What is fairness? Who decides beauty? Is choice noble when it is honest but naive? Does love absolve injury or merely decorate it? Even the gods, in their higher rooms, stared into cups and saw futures that looked back without blinking. The hinge, one of Hephaestus's finest, still turned smoothly on the hall where the apple had first rolled. It creaked only once, the way even the best-made things do when the story changes direction. Down in the lower world, far from palaces and parades, a girl stooped among flowers, coaxed by a rumor of sweetness growing where shadows lengthen at noon. Seeds slept under her feet with their careful secrets. The earth, old mother and great negotiator, listened to a different kind of claim being prepared. A chariot rehearsed its path in silence. A pomegranate ripened into its law. War would have its decade. Love would have its wages. But in a meadow not yet bruised by history, spring held its breath and waited for a footfall that would teach the seasons how to take turns. Noon had thinned itself to a pale silk when she wandered farther than habit, following a rumor made of scent and color, a hush of sweetness where the meadow dipped and the grass decided to lean toward shadow. Persephone stooped among the flowers the way a musician bends toward a familiar instrument, coaxing from petals a music only bees fully understand. She was a child of ripeness and careful hands. Demeter's laughter had been the calendar of her mornings. Her afternoons learned patience from the slow arithmetic of seeds. That day, a bloom unlike the others opened a little door in the air. It was not just gorgeous, it behaved like a secret invited to speak.
She reached for it, and the ground answered. The seam of the earth unzipped politely then with purpose. A wind rose that did not belong to weather. Hooves hammered a rhythm the meadow had never practiced. A chariot ruptured the afternoon, dark and well-made, drawn by horses that knew corridors beneath the world. The driver's face was not cruel so much as disciplined by solitude. He wore the grave courtesy of one who keeps an archive no one else wants to inventory. Hades reached for her, not as a thief reaches, but as a ruler whose petition has been heard by a court no mortal can attend. In some tellings, she cried out, a note that traveled the length of the season and shattered on her mother's ear. In others, she hesitated, as if recognizing a chord her life had been missing. Historians still argue, abduction or arrangement, trespass or treaty? Perhaps the truth sits at the foxed edge where consent and destiny rub thin. The chariot folded them into secrecy. The grass, dignified, lay back down and pretended ignorance. Above, the clouds resumed their mild work as if no hinge had turned. What she found beneath was not chaos, but architecture. Passages held up by law as old as sorrow. Halls the temperature of deep wells. Rivers that remember every story but will not say so until asked with the correct coin. Shadows here were not punishments. They were filing systems. Hecate's torches kept a soft, sane light in the corners. The gates had hinges too perfect for boasting. Cerberus looked up and seeing a mistress in the making, rehearsed gentleness with only 2 of his 3 mouths, while the third remained on duty. Persephone's breath slowed until it matched the tempo of stone. She was offered a throne, but she sat first on a simple bench near a garden of pale blossoms that open at night. Hades, with the caution of a man who has learned the cost of wanting, spoke to her not of crowns, but of work. The administration of endings, the mercy of proportion, the long, deliberate art of letting go without contempt. His voice carried a memory of ore, of the straight honesty of metal. If he loved her, it was not the consuming love of myth's louder lovers. It was a steadier vow, a promise to share a kingdom that would never be celebrated by the sun. Demeter, above, did not negotiate with nuance. She felt the lack like a frost sweeping wheat before dawn can defend it. Fields forgot their grammar. Granaries developed a cough. The world tried to feed itself with memory and found memory makes a poor meal. Gods spoke in their older voices, and compromise arrived the way autumn does, slowly, and then all at once. Messages traveled by torch and root. The earth, which will not choose between children, proposed the law it prefers for all contested spaces. Take turns, half the year above, half below, or, if you like, a braid of light and quiet woven through each calendar. Yet law waits for consent. In a room the color of ash, a pomegranate rested like a heart that had decided to believe in ritual. Its seeds shone with the precise red of an honest wound.
She lifted them, counted them with a seamstress's care, and let a few pass her lips. To eat is to belong. The choice, small as it looked on the tongue, became a hinge on which the world would swing forever. Some say she was tricked. Others say she was wise enough to bind herself to both places, daughter and queen, meadow and archive, ripeness and rule. There is authority in refusing to be only one thing. When she returned, the first green rose through the brown like a soft argument against despair. Children sat up in their beds and asked for bread. Bees drafted treaties with orchards. Demeter's shoulders lowered from around her ears, and the air remembered it could smell of loam and apple peel. Persephone walked the fields with the expression of the newly promoted, tender, alert, not quite trusting the miracle to continue. She did not forget the corridors below. When she went back down, she did not fall. She descended like weather that has a reason. Lamps were lit along her route. The dead, who are, in truth, only the finished, lifted their eyes to greet a queen whose crown was not ostentation but attention. She settled disputes with the fairness of someone who has learned that grief comes in flavors: sharp, dull, baffled, proud. She listened as if listening were a tool, and it is. Seeds know this. A kernel sleeps in a dark it does not fear. It wakes when held kindly by pressure and warmth. Persephone made of the underworld a cultivated dark, a winter with curriculum. Above, poets train themselves to say when instead of if about spring. They learn to notice the first reversible colors at the edge of snow, to trust that sleep is not betrayal. Farmers broke bread and remembered to laugh with their mouths full. Mothers, braver than gods, taught their children to wave goodbye and mean, "See you soon." In councils under bright roofs, laws were argued about the ownership of grain. In kitchens, women understood that the real law is survival managed with grace. There were still losses, always losses, but the world traded eternal panic for a rhythm. That rhythm, the slow swing between loss and return, began to teach other things their measures. Lovers quarreled less permanently. Kings reconsidered sieges when winter knocked on the door with an empty bowl. Even the moon, already an expert at coming and going, seemed to nod. See, this is how you train absence to be a companion rather than a tyrant. There were days when Demeter could not help her suspicion. She counted the weeks on her fingers like a suspicious bookkeeper, scowling at clouds that came too soon. There were nights when Hades, remembering how daylight gestures so easily, paced the length of his throne room and envied shadows their talent for consolation. And there were hours when Persephone stood on a threshold, one hand in the wheat, one hand on cool stone, and felt herself not divided but doubled, a hinge rather than a tier. Power and nurture are not enemies, except when frightened men insist they must be. In some villages, they still bake loaves patterned with seeds when the equinox leans through the afternoon. They still press their thumbs into the dough to make small moons that will brown into memory. They still set one slice on a windowsill for the creatures who prefer night. In certain groves, old women whisper to saplings, telling them that the queen will be back soon and that the trick is to hold your green like a secret until the air says yes. Scholars still compose delicate papers about whether the myth is instruction or consolation. Does it explain winter or teach us how to inhabit it? Is the pomegranate a trap or a vow? The answers likely rest in the way soil accepts both seed and ash with the same sober hospitality. At the border between seasons, there is always a moment. The air tastes metallic. Birds mistake noon for evening. A shawl feels suddenly wiser than a sleeve when you can feel the wheel under everything click into its next notch. Listen then. Somewhere a door you cannot see is opening inward. Somewhere a girl is becoming a queen without ceasing to be a daughter. Somewhere a field is remembering how to pronounce the word enough. And far off, where a mountain keeps its own counsel and laurel leaves whisper even when the wind is asleep, a different kind of quiet gathers. The kind that lives in questions asked carefully and in breaths held before answers. A shrine waits with a mouth shaped like the future, and the old stone that once sang for kings wonders if its voice has grown faint or only more selective in its mercies. The road climbed in patient switchbacks through time and stone, and at each turn the air grew cleaner, as if the mountain itself were making a promise about clarity, yet even promises age. Delphi rested where a god once persuaded a serpent to give up its claim on a spring, where a theater cup sound like a careful palm, where laurel leans over terraces and whispers to wind. Pilgrims came with dust on their cuffs and questions braided into their breath. They brought honey cakes, the soft shine of coin, and a willingness to hear themselves slightly scolded by heaven. In the Adyton, where light moderated itself to a sacred dim, the woman on the tripod let trance discover her, the way sleep discovers the tired. She chewed laurel leaves without hurry. A bowl of Castalian water remembered dawn in its coolness. Somewhere beneath, earth exhaled a thin, strange sweetness through little cracks, the sort of perfume that convinces certainty to loosen its jaw. When she spoke, it was rarely a speech and never a shout. It was more like weather, phrases arriving in gusts and then dying to a hush in which men tried to collect meaning like rain in their hands. They say a king once asked whether war would end him or thicken his legend. The god answered in a sentence that behaved like a coin tossed into riverlight. If you cross that border, a great empire will fall. He went home believing the empire would be someone else's. He learned, as most of us do, that prophecy is a mirror obliging us to supply the face. In another year, a sailor statesman came uphill to ask how a city of clever talkers might survive when the horizon darkened with oars. The voice, smelling faintly of resin and noon, answered with wooden walls, and the city, teased by metaphor into prudence, found salvation in ships and a bluff of empty stone. Later, a man with an appetite for conquering the map paused beneath the laurel and was told he was invincible. Perhaps the god meant he would outlive his own limits in story, which is one kind of immortality and not the gentlest. Always, what was said arrived carrying both lamp and shadow, and men who prefer either clarity or thunder learned the slower art of living with both. Yet time, which respects even temples only by passing them through, began its unadvertised work. The spring that had once run with an eagerness bordering on laughter narrowed. The fissures below cooled their phrases. The laurel kept greenness but offered fewer glosses. It was not a punishment. It was the weariness even sacred places know when asked too often to carry the burdens people refuse to set down themselves. Plutarch, who kept company with the shrine as a thoughtful neighbor might with an elderly friend, wrote about how the god sometimes seemed away, as if the world were learning to speak moral sentences without leaning so hard on riddles. Priests grew more careful with their calendars. Questions multiplied faster than answers. The tripod learned the ache known to old chairs that have held too many confessions. Rome arrived the way snow arrives in high country, first as ornament, then as climate. Generals came to ask about borders. Merchants asked about margins. Lovers, still lovers, asked whether vows could be persuaded to behave. The god obliged as he could. But a new music was rehearsing elsewhere, a faith that preferred a single flame to a many-windowed dawn, and people who had trained their hearts to hush for vaporous counsel learned to wish for words that marched in straight lines from a single throne of heaven. The omphalos stone, once the belly button of a world that imagined itself a body, became a curiosity for tourists of empire. The Sibyl's chair, empty on certain days, looked briefly like any other seat. Even the great colonnades, which know how to pose for history, felt their paint turn to memory, and their flutes fill with wind that no longer carried Laurel's private jokes. The last answers were modest, domestic, almost apologetic, as if a voice that had once negotiated with kings now preferred to bless harvests and nudge quarrels toward a truce. In winter, when fog climbed the ravine and the theater's stone benches wore thin shawls of cloud, you could imagine the god napping rather than departing. In spring, when Narcissus insisted on its cool perfume and bees rehearsed, you could imagine the god had moved outside, content to answer lightly through weather and the hands of women needing bread. People later would claim that the oracles ceased because the true voice arrived and filled all rooms, or because the earth stopped whispering through her seams, or because men learned to listen to experiments instead of epiphanies. Perhaps all these are true, braided. Perhaps gods grow tired when mortals ask them to carry choices we should make ourselves. Down in the valley, a newer road bit into the hillside, sure of destinations. Above, the old sacred way kept its habit of teaching feet to slow. If you sit there now amid stones that refuse melodrama, you may still feel the faint vibration of questions put honestly. Will the harvest forgive our pride? Can a city be brave without becoming brutal? What becomes of love when winter lingers? The mountain does not answer, not exactly. It lends you patience, and sometimes that is the nearest thing to divine speech. I like to think the Pythia, when the last questioner had gone and the last priest had folded up the day, stood quietly at the temple's threshold and listened to the valley's blue. I like to think she felt no defeat, only the ordinary piece of work completed and of trust passed to the next weather. She might have taken a leaf of laurel between her fingers, breathed its green, and smiled at the notion that truth ever belonged to a room. Truth travels along goat paths, in mothers' warnings and lovers' hesitations, in the small diagnostic cough of a cracked amphora, and the way a child goes still when a story's important part begins. Twilight came to Delphi as twilight comes to all attentive places, not as erasure but as a long, intelligent pause. The columns went on playing their austere music with shadow. The spring, less talkative, kept being cold and good. A shepherd on Parnassus called to his dog. A girl below learned the rhythm of the loom and, by it, the rhythm of thinking. There are answers everywhere when we have learned to wear questions gently. And now, dear listener, you who have walked with me through tides and marble, through labyrinth and laurel, through grief taught to sing and courage taught to be quiet, thank you for your company in these soft, attentive nights.
Thank you for lending your breath to these old rooms, for letting the hush between words cradle you. May the fragments of these myths settle in you like calm embers. May they warm your sleep without burning your rest. It has been an honor to keep you company across 17 small evenings. Now, let the lids grow heavy. Let the heart unlace its sandals, and let the world dim to its kindest settings. If dreams visit, may they be gentle and wise. And if the past comes softly to your bedside, may it sit, not to instruct, but to hum an old lullaby. Good night, and thank you for listening.